Chapter 1. Jasmine stood at the back of the church, making sure all the hymnals were put into the back of the pews like they should be. She hated to walk in and find the hymnals scattered everywhere. She didn't know why it was a pet peeve, but it was. Besides, she was hoping that Lee Fields would stop and talk to her on his way out. That was the real reason she was obsessing over hymnals. She wanted a chance to be close to Lee. Lee was a widower who had a ranch very close to where Jasmine lived with her sister, Daisy. She was only going to stay for a couple more months until Daisy got into a routine with the housework, cooking, and the baby before she went back to Seattle to her mother. If Jasmine got her way, though, she would be married before that happened. Married to Lee and mother to his adorable 7-year-old twin boys. Daisy was ready to handle things herself now, but she'd agreed that she could use the help for another month or two. Jasmine had long red hair that reached almost to her knees, and her eyes were a dark brown. She was the 5th of 8 sisters, all of them named after flowers, so it made her happy to be away from Seattle, where she'd been raised. You couldn't swing a dead cat in Seattle without hitting one of the Sullivan girls. She knew she was only 18, but she knew she could handle the boys. They were sweet most of the time. Honestly, though, they reminded her of herself when she was small. She knew that not everyone had considered her lovable when she was little, but she had been, and so were Lee's boys. They made her smile every time she talked to them. Joseph and Jacob ran over to her and smiled up at her angelically. She knew that look. She'd perfected that look. "What are you two up to now?" she asked, trying to keep her voice stern in hopes she'd be their mother soon. Joseph shrugged innocently, while Jacob covered his mouth. A scream went up from across the church, and Jasmine crossed her arms over her chest. "Your handiwork?" She shook her head as if she was disappointed in them. The truth was she wanted to know which prank they'd pulled. She'd pulled them all at one time or another. "We put a frog in Mrs. Kyle's purse." Joseph let out a little giggle. Within seconds, Lee was standing behind the boys with a hand on each shoulder. "I have a feeling I know where that frog came from," he said in a low, gravelly voice. He obviously knew his boys were the cause of most of the mischief that happened when they were around and was doing his best to prevent it. Jasmine bit her lip to keep from laughing. That was the type of prank she'd played for years, and she still found them funny. She didn't do things like that any longer, because she'd turned over a new leaf, but could she help it that it amused her? Lee gave her a look that told her he wasn't amused by her laughter. "I'll be back to deal with you in a moment." He had each boy gripped by their upper arm and dragged them out of the church and into the churchyard. Jasmine stayed where she was, waiting for him to scold the boys. She talked to several people before Lee came back inside, the whole time knowing very well what Lee would be saying to the boys. She'd heard it all. "Did you have to laugh?" Jasmine grinned up at Lee. "I couldn't help it. It was funny." She wasn't the least bit repentant and wouldn't pretend to be. His boys were precious, and if he couldn't see that, she'd be happy to point it out to him. Lee shook his head. "If they were playing those jokes on you, it wouldn't be so funny. But the boys love me. They'd never do anything like that." She wondered if she could teach them some of her better jokes. It was fun to teach others the ways of practical jokes. At least the jokes that were just funny and not harmful. Giving them up was one thing, but teaching them to others? It would be pure joy for her. Of course, if she wanted to be a mother figure to them, she needed to get rid of that idea. No matter how much fun it would be. Lee shook his head. "I wouldn't be so sure." He offered her his arm to leave the church. "Would you like to go for a Sunday drive with the boys and me this afternoon?" He said the words quickly as if he were nervous and trying to get them out. "I'd love that." Jasmine had been hoping for an invitation to do something, anything, with him for months. She wasn't certain if she wanted to be his wife or the boys' mother more. She liked the idea of being both. Lee walked her to the wagon where Daisy and Eli were talking to their mother, Mary, and their Aunt Harriet. Daisy's eyes grew wide as she saw Jasmine approaching on Lee's arm. "Are you ready to go, Jasmine?" Daisy's eyes met Jasmine's and Jasmine could see her sister was trying to tell her something. "Just about." She smiled up at Lee. "Since Mama and Aunt Harriet are here to help you today, I was wondering if you'd mind if I went on a drive with Lee and the boys this afternoon." Jasmine knew her sister wouldn't tell her no, because she worked so hard around the house helping her out. Aunt Harriet smiled at Lee. "Hi, I'm Harriet Farmer." She held her hand out to shake his. Harriet would be the one to decide if Lee was good husband material, and she would let Jasmine know if she should marry him or not. Jasmine desperately wanted Aunt Harriet to like Lee. Lee shook her hand. "It's nice to meet you, ma'am. I'm Lee Fields. I have a ranch a few miles from here." "How old are your boys, Lee?" Harriet asked. "I have 7-year-old twins. They're a handful." Lee looked over at the boys, as if to make certain they hadn't said anything on first since he'd seen them 30 seconds before. Harriet smiled. "All 7-year-old boys are handfuls." She looked at Jasmine for a moment. "Why don't we keep the boys so the two of you can make the drive alone? I'm sure it would be nicer without 2 squirmy boys trying to get in between the two of you." Lee looked at Jasmine. "I'd like that a lot." Lee was a tall man with dark hair and eyes. He wore his cowboy hat every moment he wasn't in the church. Jasmine nodded. "Thank you, Aunt Harriet." She knew that her aunt's investigations of Lee would begin immediately, but that was a good thing for her. It meant she could agree to marry him sooner, and she really wanted to marry him before it was time for her to return home. Jasmine turned back to Lee with a smile. "I'll see you this afternoon then?" "I'll be by around 2, he told her. "I'll tell the boys to be on their best behavior." Mary, Jasmine's mother, shook her head. "If we could deal with Jasmine, we can deal with anything." She gave her 5th daughter a look that spoke volumes. Jasmine knew she'd been a handful in ways the other girls hadn't. She'd enjoyed teasing and playing pranks more than your average 10-year-old boy from the time she was 3 until about a year before. When she'd realized there was no way she was going to be able to marry because of her reputation, she'd tried to tone things down a bit. She wouldn't have if she hadn't wanted to at least have a shot at marrying, though. She liked having fun and joking with people. It made life more interesting. Jasmine blushed a little, hoping that Lee wouldn't think anything of her mother's words. "I'll see you at 2, Lee." She couldn't wait. Living in a house with a newlywed couple for several months, and realizing how in love her sister was, made her want to marry herself. Lee nodded. "I'll be there." He strode off toward his wagon, and Jasmine watched him go, thinking just how much she already cared for him, even though they'd never seen one another outside of church. Of course, he was handsome enough to make her heart stop beating, and that didn't hurt anything at all. Jasmine climbed into the buggy with her family, feeling starry-eyed. Lee was a good-looking, successful rancher. She knew her aunt would have nothing against him. As soon as they sat down, Daisy turned to her, her arms free for once as Mary held her granddaughter, Dinah, snuggling her close. "Jasmine, Lee's boys are absolute terrors. They're worse than you were. You can't be thinking of marrying him." Daisy's face was covered with concern. She truly wanted the best for her sister, even though they'd just learned to get along. Jasmine made a face. "If any woman can handle those 2 boys, it's me. I know how they think." She wasn't going to listen to any arguments. Lee was the man for her, and she couldn't wait to be a mother to his delightful boys. Daisy shook her head. "I can see by the look on your face that you're not going to listen to me, but I think you're making a huge mistake." She turned back around, making it clear she'd given the warning she felt the need to give, but she'd say nothing else on the subject. Harriet patted Jasmine. "Do you want me to start the investigation immediately?" she asked. "I feel like I need to since we leave in a week." Jasmine nodded eagerly. "I really want to marry him, Aunt Harriet." She loved the idea of being able to marry before the 2 of them left for Seattle. Her mother would insist on bringing the entire family back out for the wedding otherwise. Mary shook her head adamantly. "I don't want 2 of my daughters living here. You need to come back to Seattle, Jasmine. You don't know this man. Listen to your sister." Mary was obviously grasping at straws and trying to come up with any argument she could to get Jasmine back to Seattle. She wanted her daughters all to live on the same street she did in Seattle, so she would be surrounded by her grandchildren at all times. Jasmine sighed. Mama, there's not a man in Seattle who would marry me, and we both know it. They would expect to wake up to a snake in their boots or something. She'd had a great deal of fun with her pranks in the past, but she now wished she hadn't been so public with them. Putting honey on the teacher's chair and a snake in her desk drawer were things she probably never should have done. That's your own fault, Jasmine, Mary told her daughter. Don't punish me by moving away. I'm not trying to punish anyone, Mama. Lee is the man I want to marry. Is that so hard to believe? Jasmine couldn't believe her mother thought she was trying to punish her. Why was it so wrong that she fell for a man in another state? Mary sighed. Well, I suppose he is handsome. Jasmine smiled, patting her mother's arm. Yes, he is. He'll be a good husband to me. What happened to his first wife? Harriet asked, needing to know so she could start her investigation. Eli was the only one with the answer to that. Right after the twins were born, there was a blizzard. She wandered out into it and was found days later. She'd frozen to death. Her entire body had been mutilated by a wild animal. They were barely able to identify her. Jasmine put her hand to her mouth in surprise. She'd had no idea. Why did she wander out? Why would anyone go anywhere in a storm like that? Eli shrugged. No one knows. She may have had to use the outhouse or get something from the barn. Lee was sleeping at the time. She did it in the middle of the night after feeding one of the boys. Jasmine shook her head. Those poor boys have been motherless for 7 years? That's so sad. Hearing the story made Jasmine want to be the boy's mother even more. Harriet and Mary exchanged looks. Jasmine was definitely going to be difficult if she didn't get to marry Lee. Lee lectured the boys the entire way home. No more frogs. You scared the dickens out of Mrs. Kyle. Why couldn't his boys go to church and sit still and behave like other children? Was he so lacking as a father? Joseph folded his arms over his chest. She deserved it. She said mean things. Joseph was the more hard-headed of the twins. He was a redhead versus Jacob's blonde hair, so that explained a lot in Lee's mind. Lee sighed. What did she say? He was almost afraid to know. Many of the ladies at church complained about his boys and his parenting, but with good reason. She said we were hellions, and you were a terrible father, Jacob answered. He was obviously offended by the woman's words. I don't even know what a hellion is. Lee was inclined to agree with the older woman, but he couldn't say that to the boys. He decided to ignore the unspoken question about the meaning of the word hellion. That's no reason to scare her. That's just proving her point. We don't like her. We don't like anyone but you. And sometimes Miss Sullivan. Jacob was never afraid to say what he thought, which was both good and bad in Lee's opinion. Raising the 2 boys on his own had been more than a little difficult. He'd tried for years to find a mother for them, but as they'd gotten older, their reputation as pranksters had gotten worse and worse. He smiled as he thought about Jasmine. He didn't know her well, but she was a pretty little thing and didn't seem to be afraid of his boys. Good enough for him. He'd ask her to marry that afternoon if she seemed at all interested. She was related to Daisy King, and Daisy was the picture of perfection in his mind. I'm glad you like Miss Sullivan, Lee said. I'm going to take her for a drive this afternoon to get to know her better. You 2 have got to be on your best behavior. He knew it was a lot to ask his boys, but maybe, if they knew they could get Jasmine for a mother, they'd do it just this once. Jacob looked at his father excitedly. Is she going to be our new ma? It was obvious he wanted her to be his new mother. Both boys had really taken a liking to her in a way they never had any other woman. Lee shrugged. I'd like her to be, but you 2 had better not make it so her family won't let her marry me. Both her mother and her aunt will be there. You've got to be on your very best behavior. No pranks, no running in the house. No loud noises. There were other things he should tell them not to do, he knew, but he couldn't think of any just then. Hopefully they'd understand it encompassed all bad behavior and not just the things he'd mentioned. Joseph turned to Lee with a smirk. "We know how to behave, Papa. We just don't choose to most of the time." Lee knew that was true. The boys could be absolute angels when they wanted something. "So you'll behave properly today? Because you want Miss Sullivan to be your new ma?" He said a silent prayer that they'd do what they were told for a change. Joseph seemed to think about it for a moment before finally nodding. "We can do that." Jacob agreed. "We'll do our very best." Lee breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe, for once, they'd do what they were told and not try to take over whatever corner of the world they happened to be in. Jasmine was dressed and waiting for Lee at 2:15, watching out the window for him. She couldn't wait to finally be able to be alone with the man and talk to him. Maybe he'd even kiss her. Having 4 older sisters, she'd seen a lot of kisses, and they'd always seemed a little too intense for her tastes. Now that she had a man in her sights, she liked the idea of intensity. Harriet had spent the afternoon asking Eli everything he knew about the man, whom he'd known for years. Jasmine had ignored it all as she helped out with the chores before dressing for her drive. She wore her best bonnet and a dress that he hadn't seen yet. Her mother had brought her a new dress from Seattle, and she'd almost worn it that morning, but had decided she'd rather wait for a special occasion. A drive with Lee was just what she'd been thinking about. She saw Lee pull up into the yard and set the brake. He got down and talked to the boys for a moment. She could just hear him. She was certain he was lecturing them both to be on their best behavior. If they were like she'd been, their best behavior didn't reach other children's worst, and she knew very well how much they were like her. She opened the door for the boys and they traipsed inside. She patiently introduced them to her mother and aunt, even though she badly wanted to be on her way. "Mama, Aunt Harriet, these are Jacob and Joey. Joey has the red hair and Jacob is the towhead." She added the second part so the boys wouldn't decide to pretend to be each other. She'd known a lot of twins who had done that. Mary and Harriet smiled down at the boys a bit warily. Jasmine knew what Daisy had said worried them both. "It's nice to meet you," Harriet told them. Joey nodded. "It is nice to meet us." Lee prodded Joey in the back. "It's nice to meet you, too." The boy sounded miserable as he said the words he knew he should have said to begin with. Jacob smiled up at Harriet. "Are you Miss Sullivan's ma?" "'Cause we like her a lot." Jasmine couldn't believe just how charming his smile was as he looked at her mother. She almost felt slighted that he'd never tried to charm her that way. She'd assumed the boys didn't know how. Harriet shook her head. "No, I'm her aunt." She pointed to Mary. "That's her ma." Jacob and Joseph surrounded Mary and pulled her to a chair before climbing on her lap. "Tell us how she was when she was little." Mary's eyes met Jasmine's as if she were asking for permission. Jasmine gave a slight nod. She wanted the boys to know she knew all about pranks so they'd know not to mess with her. "Well, I have 8 daughters," Mary began. Jasmine smiled at Lee. "Are you ready to go?" She didn't want him to hear the stories her mother would undoubtedly tell. It would be better if he found out just how mischievous she'd been after they were married. Lee nodded, putting his hand to the small of her back to guide her out the door. Once they reached his wagon, he helped her up. "I'm sorry I don't have a buggy." He could tell, by the way her family dressed, she'd been raised with finer things than he could provide. Jasmine shrugged. "I don't mind riding in a wagon." She sat toward the middle of the seat, so she could be close to him but not interfere with his driving. Her eyes were full of laughter as he climbed into the wagon with her. "I loved it when Joey told my aunt that it was nice she got to meet him." Lee groaned. "I could have done without that nonsense." He picked up the reins and unset the brake. "How would you feel if I took you to the restaurant in town?" If he took her for a drive, and took her to the restaurant, they'd have plenty of time to get to know one another. Jasmine nodded. "That sounds nice. We'd better let Mama and Aunt Harriet to know, though. They'll wait supper on me otherwise." He reset the brake and jumped down to go to the house and ask if they minded. It was her aunt who came to the door. "Would you mind if I took Jasmine to the restaurant in town?" Harriet nodded with a smile. "We'll feed the boys. You two have fun." She seemed to genuinely not mind being saddled with the twins. He was thankful her aunt and mother had been there, because he had the feeling Daisy never would have volunteered to watch them. Lee thanked her and ran for the wagon before she changed her mind. He climbed up beside Jasmine again and drove off slowly. He decided to drive in a circle around Billings before taking her into town for supper. "So tell me about Jasmine. What happened to make you come out here?" Not many women chose Billings, Montana, as a place to visit. There just wasn't anything to do there if you weren't a cowboy. My sister, Daisy, came out here as a mail-order bride and married Eli, which I'm pretty sure you know. My mother was not happy she moved so far from home, and she'd have to live without servants. We were raised in a house where there were always servants around. She shrugged. She didn't care that she'd had servants and didn't now, but her mother certainly did. He nodded. "I have a housekeeper." She wasn't certain why he'd volunteered that, so she just kept talking. "When Daisy got pregnant, Mama was worried about her being out here doing all the cooking and cleaning on her own without help, so she asked me if I'd be willing to come out and help. I knew nothing about how to cook or clean, but I agreed, because I wanted to get out of Seattle. So I'll stay for another month or two, but then Mama really wants me to return to Seattle. Please ask me to stay. Please ask me to stay." Lee looked at her out of the corner of his eye. "And do you want to return to Seattle? Is there a beau waiting there for you?" He held his breath as he waited for her answer. Jasmine shook her head. "Oh no. No man in Seattle would have me." She realized as soon as the words were out what she'd said, and she covered her mouth with her hand. She needed to stop being so blunt. "Besides, I'd never have come out with you if I did." Lee choked out a laugh. "Why would no man in Seattle have you? You're a beautiful girl." He couldn't fault her honesty. If he wanted a woman who would always tell him the truth, he'd just found her. Jasmine shrugged. Well, I was a bit of a prankster when I was younger." She tried to downplay the importance of what she'd been like. He gave her an inquiring look. "How much younger?" "Oh, I gave all that up at least a year ago." She managed not to even smirk as she said the words. His laughter filled the air. "I like you, Jasmine Sullivan." He'd enjoyed their talks at church before, but he'd wanted to get to know her better one-on-one. She seemed like a truly good woman. Jasmine smiled, squeezing the arm closest to her, and feeling the muscle bulge from it. His arms were strong from his hours of work on the ranch. "I like you too." That was an understatement, of course, but it was honest as far as it went. Lee smiled over at her. "Well, then I think I'm glad I invited you on a drive this afternoon." "I know I am." He talked about the different ranches as they passed them for a few minutes. "What happened to the boy's mother?" she blurted out. She needed to hear the words from him and let him know that his past mattered to her. Lee's face turned sad. She wandered out into a blizzard and froze to death. He confirmed what Eli had said, but added nothing. He had no desire to talk about his late wife. She'd made his life miserable. "Why?" Jasmine asked. If she found out he'd hit his wife, she didn't know what she'd do. Lee shrugged, but his face grew harder and his arms grew taut on the reins. "I'm really not sure. She did it after she fed Joseph one night. The boys were only about a month old." "How did you manage?" Jasmine couldn't imagine a man trying to raise two babies. He shrugged. "I hired a housekeeper and a nurse for the boys. Between the two we managed. We went through a series of nurses, but the boys have had the same housekeeper since they were a baby. He'd kept her around so the boys would have stability in their lives. Mrs. Banks wasn't the easiest woman to have around, but she was a hard worker, and she seemed to like the boys. At least she seemed to like them some of the time." "Why have you gone through a series of nurses?" Jasmine asked. She couldn't imagine ever wanting to leave those sweet boys' lives. "You've seen my boys. No one is willing to work for me for long." He hated pointing out their troubles, but he didn't want her to be shocked if she became their stepmother either. I think your boys are delightful. Jasmine told him the truth about his boys, but she could see by his face that he thought she was crazy for even saying it when no one else could be around them for long. He laughed. You may be the only person in the whole state to see them that way. She shrugged. They're rambunctious, but they're sweet. She laughed softly. You should have seen their faces when they came to talk to me this morning. I knew immediately they'd done something. My boys? My angelic boys? Jasmine giggled. Yes, your boys. She sighed. I put a snake in my teacher's desk once. She smiled at the memory. Her teacher had jumped at least a foot and had screamed until one of the boys came to remove it. If Hyacinth hadn't told the teacher it was her, she'd have gotten away with it. He shook his head. I think you're the perfect mother for those two. Jasmine's heart jumped. I think so too, she told him. She was certain that wasn't his marriage proposal, but she wished it was. She was ready. They needed to make a decision before Mama and Aunt Harriet left. You do? He asked, his eyes meeting hers. Could she really be saying she'd take them on? All three of them? Several women would have married him over the years if he hadn't had the boys, but they came all together, and that scared most women off. She nodded. I don't know anyone who could manage them as well as I could. She knew that was an understatement. Most women would have no clue what to do with boys as active and mischievous as Joey and Jacob. What about me? Could you manage me? He looked ahead again for a moment. I kind of come with the package. He hoped she cared about him as well as the boys, though he could see she was truly drawn to them. Jasmine smiled. I could manage you best of all. And she truly looked forward to managing him. Lee looked at her again, a smile splitting his face. You think you could, do you? I know I could. She met his eyes with no hesitation. She wasn't a shy, retiring sort, and she wasn't going to pretend to be for any man. Lee pulled off to the side of the road. It was a quiet area amongst the trees. I've been watching you at church, he told her. I know. I've been watching you watching me. He laughed. You're not a nervous and shy kind of girl, are you, Jasmine? She shook her head. I am not. Why would I be? If it bothered him that she wasn't, now was the time for him to find out. Lee set the brake and captured her face in his hands, cupping her cheeks as he gazed into her pretty brown eyes. May I kiss you? Jasmine nodded, her heart jumping. I'd love that. She couldn't wait to feel what kissing was like. Her sister certainly seemed to enjoy it. He smiled, slowly lowering his lips to hers. He knew she was young, and had probably never been kissed, so he kept the kiss light, just a gentle stroke of his lips against hers. Jasmine felt a tingling all the way to her toes when he kissed her, enjoying the feel of him against her. She put her arms around his neck, waiting for him to deepen the kiss. She was disappointed when he raised his head so quickly. That's now how her sister's husbands kissed them when they didn't think anyone was looking. Why hadn't he kissed her more deeply? Was that okay? He asked, gazing into her eyes, worried that he'd frightened her. I guess so. She couldn't keep the disappointment from her voice. What did I do wrong? He asked, surprised. Well, it was nice. It was. But when my sister's husbands kiss them, it always looks like they're eating each other's faces. Why didn't you kiss me that way? Jasmine knew what she was saying was inappropriate, but she couldn't help herself. Every time she saw him, she imagined Lee kissing her that way. Is that how you want me to kiss you? Lee asked with surprise. His first wife, Gloria, had always complained when he'd used his tongue when he kissed her. In fact, she'd complained about him touching her most of the time. She hadn't been a passionate woman and had made him feel guilty for being a passionate man. She wondered for a moment if she should admit it, but couldn't think of a good reason not to. Yes, please. He shook his head for a moment. You are something special, Jasmine Sullivan. That's not something I've heard often in my life. Sure, her parents had said it to her, but parents have to, don't they? She was glad he felt that way, though, because it made him special. He lowered his head and brushed his lips across hers again, his tongue tracing the outline of her lips. When she opened her mouth to give him access, he stroked his tongue into her mouth and against hers. Jasmine moaned softly, liking this kind of kiss more than she'd imagined even. Her arms moved to his back, stroking him through the flannel of his thick shirt. She liked this in him. No wonder her sisters were always sneaking off to kiss their husbands. She moved closer to him, pressing her breasts against his chest, and holding him tightly. Her tongue met his stroke for stroke. She wanted to be closer to him, to feel his skin against hers. She wriggled in his arms, trying to feel more of him. Lee lifted his head, slightly out of breath. "Jasmine, you're going to be the death of me." The woman apparently didn't have a shy bone in her body. He couldn't decide if that was good or bad. Jasmine looked up at him with wide eyes, not certain what she'd done wrong. "Did I do something I shouldn't have?" she asked innocently. He groaned, dropping his forehead to hers. "Not really. You surprised me though. Have you ever been kissed before?" She shook her head. "No, but I like it when you kiss me." He smiled, kissing the tip of her nose. "I can see that." He sighed. "Your mother wouldn't like us kissing that way." "Why not?" She knew her mother really didn't think she should kiss anyone before marriage, but why not that way in particular? Wasn't that the right way to kiss? Her sisters certainly seemed to think it was. He thought about how to answer that for a moment. "That's the kind of kiss you share right before making love." Did she even know what that was? "Oh. Are we going to do that?" Jasmine had no earthly idea what he was talking about and didn't really care. She wanted to be close to him, and if making love would bring them close, then she was all for it. It sounded fun, whatever it was. He looked at her for a moment, completely shocked. She obviously didn't know what making love was, or she wouldn't have asked that. "You can't do that until your wedding night, Jasmine." She sighed. "Well, that would work for me then." She would do that with him on their wedding night. That sounded good. He laughed. "Does this mean you're going to marry me?" "Well, I don't know." "Are you going to ask me?" she countered. There was nothing she could think of that she wanted more than marrying this man, and she wasn't afraid to admit it. He kissed her again, this time just a brief hard kiss pressed to her lips. How could men look at her and see her as anything less than the absolute prize she really was? "I'd rather ask you father first," he told her. He'd asked Gloria's father first, as all men should. "Are you going to take a train to Seattle?" "Better to ask my mother. Or my aunt." "My aunt is a great choice. Aunt Harriet would love it if he asked her. She really had the final say anyway." He chuckled. "I think I'm just going to ask you." She smiled, waiting eagerly for the words. When he didn't say anything for a moment, she prompted, "Well, ask me." "What are you waiting for?" He needed to hurry up if they were going to get married before her mother and aunt went back to Seattle. The right moment? Flowers and a ring? Did she not care about the trappings? He felt like he should set a beautiful scene for her. Jasmine shook her head. "Oh, all that's just a waste on me. Just ask." He gathered her to him, hugging her tightly. "I'll ask when I'm ready, Miss Bossy." Why was she in such a hurry? She sighed. "My mother leaves in a week. Getting married before then would keep her from having to come back to Montana for the wedding." "You'd really marry me that fast?" He was shocked. Gloria had insisted on a 2-year engagement. He wasn't looking forward to a long engagement, but it was something he expected. "If my aunt says it's fine, then absolutely." She loved the idea of marrying the next day if possible. "Your aunt?" What did her aunt have to do with anything? Long story. "Are we going to dinner?" "I'm getting hungry." She really didn't want to explain about her aunt yet. "Later." "Much later." He shook his head at her, a little baffled at how the subject had changed so quickly. She was a special girl, though, and she was willing to take on his boys. That was all he was really looking for. Sure, he looked forward to having a passionate woman in his bed every night, but a mother for his boys was the real priority. Mrs. Banks, the housekeeper, was aging, and they were becoming way too much for her. Yes, let's go to dinner, he agreed. Chapter 2. He drove toward the bustling town of Billings. Before the railroad had been run through giving Billings a stop, there'd been almost nothing there. With the railroad, it was growing every day it seemed. Jasmine held onto his arm as they drove, happily talking to him about her sisters. She told him about her perfect eldest sister, Rose, her tomboy sister, Lily, and her bookish sister, Amaryllis. And, of course, you already know Daisy. Of all of her sisters, she felt like Daisy was the best. Not that she was her favorite, but that she was just a genuinely good person, when she didn't turn into crazy Daisy during pregnancy, that was. He nodded. Daisy is sweet. Are there more flowers at home? Lee couldn't get over the fact that her parents had come up with so many flower names. Of course, both of his boys had J names, so he couldn't say a lot about the flower theme. Oh yes. Hyacinth comes after me. It's hard to describe Hyacinth really. She's very sweet, but she always seems to be off in a world of her own. I guess dreamy is the best way to put it. Then comes Violet, our artist. She does the most amazing watercolors. The baby is Iris. She's certain she's going to be a doctor someday. You mean a nurse, right? He looked at her with surprise. Who'd ever heard of a woman doctor? Jasmine shook her head with a laugh. No, I mean a doctor. There are a few female doctors now. Just not very many. She personally loved the idea of her youngest sister being a doctor. Women needed to be able to do more than sit at home and sew. Especially if they were gifted healers like Iris was. Lee considered that. A woman doctor. He certainly wouldn't go see her, but he could see women who were having babies, preferring a female. He pulled to a stop in front of the restaurant and hurried around the wagon to help Jasmine down. Have you eaten here before? There weren't many places to eat a meal outside of a person's own home there, so he was happy to have the money to take her somewhere nice. She nodded. Mama and I ate here when we came out for Daisy's wedding, and I've eaten here several times since I came to live here. He looked at her in surprise. I thought Daisy was a mail-order bride. Why did you come for her wedding? Who had heard of anyone traveling with a mail-order bride? Jasmine shook her head. Mama was in a panic that Daisy was going to get out here and her fiancé was going to hurt her or something. I guess? I don't know. I just know I was told that Daisy had agreed to be a mail-order bride and I was expected to come out here and watch her marry. Jasmine knew it was strange, but she didn't care. She'd been an obedient daughter. For a change. That's really odd. Lee wasn't certain how he'd have felt about his bride showing up with her mother and sister in tow if he'd been Eli. Mama is overprotective to say the least. She loves us so much that she's worried something terrible will happen to us. We love her for it. They took the table in the corner they were shown to and looked at their menus. There wasn't a lot to choose from, so she settled on roast beef. When she'd made her decision, she set the menu down and looked over at him. It was nice to be allowed to just look at him and not be considered rude. She'd wanted to stare at him in church for months. After he put his menu down, he took her hand in his. Are you really willing to marry me if your aunt says it's okay? He couldn't believe he'd found a woman who was not only beautiful, but willing to take on his two rambunctious sons. Was it really possible? Jasmine nodded happily. I can think of nothing I'd like more. Lee smiled. I can't believe you're willing to take my boys on. They remind me so much of myself when I was younger. Really, I think we'll get along just fine. Besides, with as much as the boys liked her, they were bound to be good for her, right? She couldn't imagine anything less from those sweethearts. Well, I'm glad you're willing. That's all I can say. He brought one of her hands to his lips. He was glad she was willing in other ways as well, but until she understood what he was talking about, he wasn't going to say anything about it. His eyes dropped to her lips, and he thought about how much he enjoyed having them pressed to his. "I'm just glad you think that I'm good enough to help raise them." She looked down at her hand where it rested on the table. "I like the idea of being their mother and your wife." He smiled at her. "I like the idea of you being my wife as well." He brought her hand to his lips to kiss it softly, thinking about how nice it would be when he could kiss her in other places. "There's nothing in your past that will keep my aunt from letting us marry, is there?" She wanted to know now before she got too excited about marrying him. He looked at her in surprise. Her constant subject changes were disconcerting. "How would she know about my past?" he asked. The waitress came then, and they gave their orders before she wandered off. Jasmine looked at him. "She's going to investigate you, of course. Didn't everyone have an aunt who investigated potential spouses?" She certainly thought it was normal, but maybe that was just her family. He'd just taken a sip of his water when she said those words, and he choked a bit as the water went down wrong. "Investigate me?" "Sure. She does that to all our suitors." Jasmine shrugged as if it was a perfectly normal thing, because to her it was. Lee shook his head, surprised she could act like it was the most normal thing in the world to have an aunt who investigated potential grooms. "Does that bother you?" Jasmine shrugged. "Not really. She loves us, so she wants to make sure we don't end up married to men who will beat us or run around with other women while we're home with the children." He stared at her in amazement. At times she seemed so innocent, and at others, she seemed to know everything that had ever happened in the world. "No, she won't find anything in my past. Unless she found out that his first wife had hated him, herself, and their boys." Of course, that wasn't something he'd done wrong, was it? He refused to think about that while he was with her. He spent enough hours worrying that he'd been a horrible husband that he didn't need to do it again now. Oh good. Well, it shouldn't take her terribly long to determine that. She probably started as soon as we got home from church today. She smiled. "Have you lived in Montana your whole life?" Aunt Harriet would find it so much easier to investigate him if he had. Lee was once again baffled at her subject change, but went along with it. He wasn't certain what else he should do. "I've been here since I was 10. My parents moved here when I was a boy." Aunt Harriet wouldn't care about anything that had happened before he was 10. "And the boy's mother? What was her name?" He took another sip of water before he talked about Gloria. He didn't want to be negative about his ex-wife, but he'd have to choose his words carefully to avoid that. "Gloria Sturgeon. She was from this area as well. We were childhood sweethearts. I asked her to marry me right before we graduated, and she said yes. We waited for 2 years before we got married, though." Jasmine shook her head. 2 years? I can't imagine waiting that long before we get to be alone together and touch each other." She wanted to touch him right then. She wondered if he'd let her. Maybe she should ask. He shook his head in surprise at her words again, but went on. "I thought it was too long as well, but she felt like we should wait." He took a bite of his steak. After he finished chewing, he continued. "We had the boys within a year of getting married. I'm not sure if she was ready to be a mother yet." She shrugged. "You shouldn't marry if you're not ready to be a mother. Why would anyone do that? What was wrong with his wife?" She couldn't imagine anyone not wanting to hurry and marry Lee or not wanting to have children. Lee smiled as he took another bite. Her thoughts were so in line with his that he didn't know how to express it. "I don't know. I think that's a big part of the reason she wanted to wait 2 years to get married as well. She wanted to wait a while before the children came." "Did you love her?" Jasmine asked, knowing it wasn't a tactful question, but she'd never been tactful. He considered the question for a moment. Had he loved Gloria? He thought he had, once. "I don't know. I thought I did." She nodded as she took another bite of her food. "Sometimes it's hard to know for sure, I think." She knew though. She looked at Lee, and she knew she was going to spend the rest of her life with him and give him more babies. The first time she'd seen him, she'd known he was the only man for her. The church had been crowded, and she hadn't even had a chance to meet him that day, but she'd seen him with his boys, and she'd known. I love my boys. I don't regret marrying her, if that's what you're asking. Without her, I never would have had 2 boys whom I love with all my heart. He wished he'd waited a little longer to have them. Until he'd known the woman he'd married better, but it wasn't something he could change. She thought about his words as she ate silently. Are you going to kiss me again tonight? She asked. Lee's heart jumped into his throat at her words, and he looked down at her lips, which were shiny from her food. I'd like to if you don't mind. He couldn't wait to kiss her again. Jasmine smiled happily. Oh, I'd like that too. I really like kissing. Was she supposed to tell him that? Did it matter? She had never been one to do what she was supposed to do. He choked again, wondering if she had any clue that she wasn't supposed to just blurt out things like that. You do you? Oh yes. It feels good. Makes me feel all tingly. She sipped her water. I like the kisses with tongue better than just lips, of course, but I'll take either one. I'm not too terribly picky. Lee stared at her for a moment, wondering if she would always talk this way, just announcing whatever she was feeling. Where does it make you tingle? He asked, wondering how far she'd take the conversation. Everywhere. From the top of my head to the tips of my toes. She leaned forward and looked around to see if anyone was listening. It even made me tingle between my legs. He grinned, unable to control it that time. I like knowing that, he whispered. It's not proper for you to tell me, though. Jasmine sighed and leaned back in her chair. It's something you need to know, and besides, if you haven't figured it out yet, you should know now. I'm rarely proper. She shook her head sadly. It's one of my worst faults. He laughed softly, catching her hand in his. It's one of my favorite things about you. His eyes traveled over her. That and your red hair. I love your hair. She wrinkled her nose. In my dreams, I'm always a tall statuesque blonde with blue eyes. Would you pretend I'm blonde? Of her sisters, she wanted to be like Daisy, but she wanted to look like Rose. The confusion on his face was obvious. No, because I like your red hair. It makes me happy. He could imagine what it would be like when it was down, trailing across his bare skin. I guess I'll keep it red just for you then. You were thinking of changing it? He'd heard women had ways of changing their hair color, but he didn't know anyone who had actually done it. It was just a thought. Jasmine finished eating and set her fork down, leaning back in her chair. Are you going to talk to my aunt and mother about marrying me tonight? She knew she was pressing the issue, but she wanted to marry him before her mother went back home to Seattle. He nodded. I'd like to. Do you think your aunt will have an answer yet? He wasn't certain of what the investigation into his background would be like. He felt strange sitting there eating dinner while someone was prying into the details of his life. He had nothing to hide, though. She shrugged. Knowing my aunt, she's had Eli on his horse all day taking messages to everyone Daisy and Eli can think of to make sure you're not a killer or something. Lee grinned at the picture of Eli running so many errands for her aunt. Well, I guess we'll find out, won't we? He hoped she was right. An answer before he went home that night would be wonderful. He paid their bill and they left the restaurant. It was already getting dark out and that pleased Jasmine. Can we stop on the way home and just kiss for a while? She asked. She couldn't wait to get her hands on him again. She'd never wanted to touch another human being in her life the way she wanted to touch Lee. Lee wasn't even surprised by the question. He was becoming immune to being shocked by her. I'd like that. Oh good. She frowned. We probably shouldn't stop too close to Eli's ranch, though, because I don't want my family to see us. My mother would have a fit. She giggled. Mama yelled at Eli for kissing Daisy when we first got here. He didn't even know who Mama was yet, but he knew Daisy was his bride. He laughed as he helped her onto the wagon seat and walked around to climb up beside her. She immediately moved as close to him as she could, her breast brushing against his arm as he drove. "Are you cold? I have a blanket in the back that I keep for the boys." He looked down at her as he offered, worried she was chilly in the April evening air. "Oh, no. I just like touching you." He smiled as he navigated the other horses on the way out of town. "I like it when you touch me." "You do? Really?" Jasmine was excited by the prospect. She wanted to ask him, but should she? She bit her lip. She'd been honest enough about her feelings. It wouldn't hurt to ask, right? "Could I unbutton your shirt while we kiss then? I want to feel your skin." "Jasmine, you really shouldn't say things like that." How had the girl stayed a virgin this long? He was certain her first kiss had been that day, but the way she acted, he had no clue how that had happened. He was glad she'd saved all her passion for him, though. She sighed. "I guess that's a no." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and dropped a kiss atop her head now that they were out of town. "I'd like that a lot. The problem is, I'm afraid things may get out of hand." "What do you mean?" What could get out of hand? She could touch him while they kissed, and then he would take her home to her sister's house. Right? What was the best way to explain it to her? He certainly wasn't going to be the one to explain the marriage bed to his future wife. That should be left to her mother. Or better yet, her sister. When a couple kisses and touches each other's bare flesh, it becomes hard for them to stop and not do things that are meant only to be done within marriage. There. That hadn't been so difficult. Like what? Jasmine had heard so many times that there were things she didn't need to know until it was time for her to marry. Well, it was time for her to marry, and someone needed to tell her. Lee sounded like the smart choice to her. Lee shook his head. "You need to ask your mother, or your aunt. Or your sister. Ask Daisy." He was happy to be the person to do certain things to her, but she could find out about them from someone else. "I'm asking you. If you're going to be my husband, then you're the one I'll be doing these things with, right?" Her wide innocent eyes looked up at him hoping he'd agree to tell her. He refused to budge. "I'm not explaining it. Ask a married female." She sighed. "Fine. But can I touch you like that tonight?" She thought he was just being difficult, but she wasn't going to complain as long as he let her touch him like she wanted. "I don't know if it's a good idea," he told her. Judging by the way the conversation was making him feel, he knew it wasn't a good idea. His pants were already getting uncomfortably tight. He didn't tell her that, though, because she wouldn't know what it meant. After their marriage, he might. Please? His future bride was begging to be allowed to touch his bare chest, and he was telling her no? He deserved a medal. Made of gold, with the world's largest diamond right smack in the middle of it. "Jasmine, I'm not sure if I could stop it at that." Jasmine shrugged. "I don't care. I'm going to be married to you as soon as I can anyway." She turned to him, trying to understand. What would it matter? He groaned softly. "It matters a lot. Maybe we shouldn't kiss tonight, and I should just take you home." He knew she didn't understand, but she would soon. She sighed. "No, I won't touch you. I promise." She looked down at her hands folded in her lap and wished she understood why he was being so grumpy about it. It was all he could do not to laugh at himself. She was so different than Gloria had been. Gloria had allowed one quick kiss at the end of an evening together, but there could be no tongue involved in the kiss. She preferred a kiss on the cheek. Even after they married, he was barely allowed to touch her unless the lights were off and they were under the covers, and even then she expected him to be quick about it and get business taken care of as quickly as possible. He knew with this one, if he shut the lights off, she'd get angry. He stopped about a mile from Eli's house and pulled off to the side of the road. He turned to her on the seat and pulled her to him, his mouth joining with hers. The first kiss was shallow, just a meeting of mouths, and she immediately wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down for a more passionate kiss. Her tongue was the aggressor this time, moving into his mouth and stroking against the top of his mouth. He let out a groan and pulled her more firmly against him, wondering what she would do next to surprise him. He didn't wonder when, because he knew the answer to that was very soon. She stroked his chest through the flannel of his shirt, desperately wanting to remove it. Jasmine didn't know why, but she wanted to see his skin in the moonlight. She wanted to touch his bare chest and see if there was hair on it or if it was smooth. She'd promised not to unbutton his shirt, so she settled for moving her hand between the buttons and stroking his bare chest anyway. There was a light coating of hair there, and she sighed with contentment. "You feel nice," she whispered against his lips. He turned more fully toward her on the seat, pulling her hips flush with his and her breasts up against the hard wall of his chest. His hand moved, almost of its own volition, to cup her breast in his hand. When she moaned against his lips, he sighed. "I shouldn't be touching you this way." She felt a throbbing between her legs that she wanted to stop, but she didn't know how. She wanted to press it against something. All at once, she moved on the seat until she was atop his lap, straddling him, pressing her most secret place against him. There. That felt good. She wound her fingers through his hair, continuing the kiss as she rocked against him, wanting something, but not knowing what. "You feel so good," she whispered in the darkness. Lee groaned as he felt her rocking her hips against his hardness. He'd only ever been with one woman, and he'd had no idea a woman could be this interested in sexual contact. Jasmine was a temptress, and he had to get her naked and under him as quickly as he could. He sent up a quick prayer that her aunt had asked all the questions she needed to ask to make a decision. Finally, he pushed her away, taking great gulps of air into his lungs. "Jasmine, I don't think we should kiss again until after we marry," he told her. He hated putting a stop to it, because he wanted to lay her down in the back of the wagon bed, but he knew they'd both regret it later. Well, he would anyway. She pouted, her lips full and swollen from his kisses. "But I like kissing you." Didn't he like kissing her? "And I like kissing you. Too much. I almost didn't stop." "But you did." She stroked his arm, kissing the side of his jaw. "Just a few more kisses?" He stopped once, so he could stop again, right? He looked at her with a shake of his head. "I sure hope we can get married this week. I don't know how long I can keep you pure." He was a Christian and didn't think they should be having sex before marriage, and his little bride was going to make that very hard. Almost as hard as he was at that very moment. He unset the brake and picked up the reins, determined to get her home before anything else happened between them. Jasmine rested her head against his shoulder as he drove, wishing he would have let her get closer to him. When they arrived at Eli's house, he helped her down, and she put her arms around him, kissing him one last time. "I can't wait until you don't stop me," she whispered as she turned and preceded him into the house. Lee wasn't sure what to expect when he walked into the house, but it certainly wouldn't have been what he saw. His boys were snuggled up beside Mary on the sofa, and she was telling them a story. They seemed content to actually sit still and listen, which he'd never seen happen before. Lee immediately walked to her aunt. "I was told you're the person I need to ask for Jasmine's hand." He looked over at Jasmine, who was standing there looking so innocent despite her swollen lips. "The sooner the better, please." Eli opened the door and brought a note to Harriet. "That's the last one tonight. I can't do any more writing." He walked to the stove and opened the pot on top of it, serving himself a bowl of stew, acting as if Lee wasn't standing in the middle of his kitchen. Jasmine sat down beside Eli. "Have you been running around investigating Lee all night?" She knew he didn't approve of men being investigated before they could marry, because he hadn't been warned. He seemed angry, so that must have been what he was up to. Eli nodded, glancing over at Lee. He was obviously surprised Jasmine would talk about it so openly in front of him. Lee stood waiting while Harriet unfolded and read the letter. Once she was done, she nodded. "From what I can tell, you're an upstanding citizen. The only complaint anyone has about you is that your boys are allowed to run wild, but that's understandable with no mother. A wife would be good for all three of you, I think." Harriet looked over at Jasmine. "Do you want to marry him?" Jasmine smiled. "Oh yes." Harriet looked at Mary and nodded. I think he'd suit her fine. She looked at Lee. You didn't abuse your first wife, did you? Lee couldn't believe she would just ask him that right out. Of course not. I didn't think so. I'm fine with the wedding. Mary looked at the boys snuggled against her. Would you boys like to be my grandsons? Jacob let out a loud whoop, while Joey jumped up from the sofa and ran to hug Jasmine. You'll really be our ma? Promise? Jasmine laughed, hugging the boy in return. How else am I going to get sweet boys like you two? She couldn't believe it was actually happening. She was marrying the man of her dreams, and the boys were just a bonus for her. She loved them so much already. Chapter 3. Mary walked over to the table, getting a pencil and paper on her way. Let's see, it's going to take us a while to plan this, because of the family having to come out from Seattle. She tapped the pen to the table as she spoke. We could probably get it done in a year, though. Her eyes moved to Lee's. Does that work for you? Next March would be ideal. Lee felt his heart sink. He didn't want to wait a year to marry Jasmine. How was he going to ever wait that long? There wasn't enough cold water in the world to keep taking Jasmine places. He couldn't tell the woman that her daughter wouldn't leave him alone long enough to even think about waiting. She wasn't going to be a virgin for much longer, that much he knew, and he wanted their first time to be on their wedding night. I don't know, ma'am. Jasmine shook her head. What he means to say, Mama, is that we want to be married this week before you leave for Seattle. The boys have been without a mother for long enough. She didn't add that she couldn't wait to get Lee out of his shirt. Why that was so important to her, she didn't know, but she'd never wanted to see or feel someone naked before, and now it was all she could think about. He wouldn't take off his shirt until they were married, so they needed to be married soon. It was that simple. This week? No, Jasmine. None of your sisters gave me enough time to plan a decent wedding, and you're going to. Mary shook her head, glaring at her daughter. Jasmine refused to even consider it. No, I won't. We want to get married this week. Her mother had always claimed that she was the most stubborn of her daughters, and just then, she was glad her mother knew it. She didn't need her mother's permission to marry. She was old enough to do it whenever she wanted. Mary's eyes met Harriet's. Help me here, Harriet. Harriet shrugged, laughter in her eyes. You're on your own, Mary. I think long engagements are tedious. Mary turned to Jasmine. We at least need to get you a pretty wedding gown. That's going to take longer than a week. Jasmine looked down at the dress she was wearing. This is perfect to get married in. It was a yellow dress with lace across the front and had a matching shawl. She couldn't think of anything that would suit her better. Lee nodded. I really like what she's wearing now. He did, but he would have said anything to get her to agree to marry him. Anything. No. I want at least 6 months to plan this wedding. Joey walked over to Mary and tugged at her sleeve. Grandma? I don't want to wait a whole year for my new ma. Please let me have her this week. A tear trickled down his face as he asked for what he wanted, making it clear it was important to the two boys. Mary let out a long sigh and nodded. How can I say no to this sweet face? Get married whenever you want to. She looked defeated as she dropped her pencil on the table. Jasmine smiled and looked across the room at Lee. Tuesday? That should give them both enough time to make it work. Daisy, do you still need me? I can come over during the day to help after Mama goes home. Daisy shook her head. No, I can handle things. They all knew Jasmine had never really been needed in Montana. She'd only been there to make their mother feel better. Lee thought for a moment about what needed to be done at his house before it was ready for his bride. Mrs. Banks, his housekeeper, would be off on Monday, so Tuesday sounded good. Especially if they married in the afternoon. Yes, that sounds good. Jacob looked at Jasmine. How many days is that, Ma? Jasmine smiled at his use of the word ma with her. It's 2 days. Is that soon enough? The boys looked at each other with grins. They weren't identical, but in that moment, they looked just alike. "We'll have a ma in 2 days, Joey." Jacob hugged his brother tightly. They both ran for their father at the same time, causing Lee to jump back a step. "Thank you," Jacob yelled. Lee smiled down at his boys, bending to pick one up in each arm. As Jasmine watched, he hugged both of them to him tightly. "I'm glad you boys approve of my choice." Jacob nodded. "Miss Sullivan's the best." Joey shook his head. "We have to call her Ma now." He squirmed to be let down as he walked over to Jasmine, climbing into her lap. "You're going to be the best ma 2 boys have ever had." Jasmine looked down at him with a smile. "And you 2 are going to be the best boys any ma ever had?" She wondered if they'd lie or promise to at least try. Joey sighed. "Don't you think that's asking a little much?" After the laughter died down, Lee took the boys and said he'd be there to pick Jasmine up at 2 on Tuesday afternoon. "Why don't you just meet us at the pastor's house? I'll bring everyone to town, and you can take Jasmine home with you," Eli offered. He knew it would be easier for the other man, and he had to take his wife and her family to town anyway. Lee nodded. "That sounds good. I'll see you then." He walked behind Jasmine, leaning down to whisper in her ear, "Talk to your sister." He brushed a quick kiss across her lips and left with the boys. Jasmine watched him go with a smile on her face. She was getting married. In just 2 days, she'd be Mrs. Jasmine Fields. The adventure of her lifetime was about to begin. As he drove home, Lee couldn't help but wonder what Jasmine would be told about the marriage bed. He knew she would embrace whatever it was, just like she embraced everything in life. Jasmine was a one-of-a-kind woman, and he couldn't wait to call her his wife. Once the boys were in bed, he left a note for the housekeeper, who would arrive early Tuesday morning to fix breakfast for them, letting her know that he would be bringing a bride home Tuesday evening. She'd know what to do to prepare for Jasmine. Anyone would know better than he did. Jasmine woke up when Dinah did in the middle of the night, and she wandered downstairs and into the kitchen where she knew she'd find Daisy sitting in her rocking chair nursing Dinah. She sat down at one of the chairs from the table and asked, "Will you tell me about the wedding night?" Daisy blushed, never having been as outspoken as her younger sister. "Well, what do you know?" The look on her face said she'd rather do anything than have a conversation about that topic with her sister. Jasmine made a face. "Absolutely nothing. I know that I like kissing Lee, and that he said I couldn't take his shirt off and feel his chest, because it might lead to more than we should do before marriage. That's all." After the words were out, she wondered if she should have said them, but then she decided she didn't care. Daisy knew her better than anyone, and if she was going to start judging her, she'd have done it a long time ago. Daisy met her sister's eyes, a grin transforming her tired face. "You tried to take his shirt off?" "No, of course not. I just asked him if it would be okay, because I wanted to touch him." Jasmine never would have removed his shirt without his permission. Even she knew that was rude. Daisy's giggles filled the kitchen. "Only you, Jasmine." After a moment, she calmed. "Okay, I'll tell you, but only because I got so much more information from Amaryllis than I did from Mama." She quickly explained what happened between a man and a woman. "Mama told me to lay back and let him do what he wanted, but Amaryllis told me to enjoy it. That I'd really like it if I let myself." Jasmine thought about everything that had been explained. "And do you? Like it, that is?" The idea of letting a man do what Daisy had described was odd, but she did like the idea of being so close to Lee. Daisy nodded with a blush. "It feels really good after the first time." "I can believe that. I feel tingly all over when he kisses me." Jasmine made a face. "No wonder he got flustered when I told him his kisses made me tingle between my legs. And no wonder he was afraid things would go too far, too quickly. He could tell that's what she wanted." Daisy's laughter couldn't be contained a second longer. "I love you, Jasmine. I'm so glad you're staying close, even though I'm a demented nincompoop?" Jasmine asked, knowing that Amaryllis and Daisy had called her the name for years, before Daisy had ever admitted it to her. Daisy grinned. You're still a demented nincompoop, but I can't help but love you for it. Thank you for telling me. Jasmine really was glad she wouldn't have to hear the explanation from her mother. It was so much easier getting the facts from her sister. You're welcome. Now, do you have any questions? Jasmine thought about it and realized she had a few, but she wasn't certain her sister could answer them without becoming terribly embarrassed. She'd ask Lee. Now that she knew what would happen between them, she was sure he wouldn't mind answering the little questions. I don't think so. Thanks again. I may ask more questions later. She hurried up the stairs to her room, lying in bed, staring at the darkness above her. How would it feel? She thought about how she'd climbed onto his lap and pressed herself against him and smiled. It was going to feel really good. She couldn't wait. Tuesday night could not come soon enough. Jasmine had everything packed and ready to go by noon on Tuesday. She felt badly about abandoning her sister, but she knew that Daisy would do just fine without her help. She'd only told her mother she should stay a little longer so she could spend more time getting to know Lee and the boys. She cleaned her room and put clean sheets on her bed, getting it ready for the next visitor her sister may have. You never knew when a flower might escape from Seattle to visit her sisters in Montana. It might even be nice to invite Hyacinth out for a visit. She'd realized when she'd given Lee the rundown of her sisters that Hyacinth, the sister she'd shared a room with for years, was a complete mystery to her. Could that possibly be a good thing? She carried her bag down the stairs and put it beside the front door, before going to make lunch for her family. Are you going to be cooking for your new family? Her mother asked from behind her. Jasmine shook her head. Not unless I want to. Lee employs a housekeeper who cooks for them. She knew her mother would be thrilled with that news. She didn't like the idea of her girls having to do all their own chores. They weren't brought up to do them, so they shouldn't have to. Oh good. I was hoping you wouldn't be living in the same conditions as your sister. Jasmine grinned. I don't think Daisy lives in bad conditions, but no, I'll have a housekeeper. I'll probably cook some of the meals, because I've discovered I enjoy it. She loved the idea of cooking for Lee and the boys. It just seemed like something she would enjoy doing, on occasion when she felt like it. After lunch, they all left the house and got into the buggy. Jasmine was surprised she was getting nervous about the wedding. Well, not about the actual ceremony, but about whether she'd be a good wife. Her mother had given her the talk and she was thrilled she'd already talked to Daisy about what would happen, because her mother had fumbled through and made it sound like something horrific. The smile on Daisy's face when she'd explained it had said a lot, though. Lee and the boys were waiting outside the church when they arrived. He helped Jasmine down and kissed her cheek. You look beautiful. His eyes traveled up and down her body, and she almost felt as if he could see through her dress. Jasmine smiled. You make me feel beautiful. She pulled his head down so she could whisper against his ear. You were right. I talked to Daisy and my mother, and Daisy gave me much better information. He chuckled. Trust it to Jasmine to bring up their wedding night just before the ceremony. Does that mean you like the idea of it? He watched her closely as she answered, desperately needing her to want to make love with him. She nodded with a blush. I can't wait. Her answer was nothing less than honest, which was exactly what he expected from her. Mary stopped beside them. You two have the rest of your lives to whisper to each other. Let's get you married. Even Mary seemed to see the urgency of getting the two married. They were obviously not going to wait much longer whether the wedding happened or not. Harriet caught Jasmine's hand before she headed into the church. I found this just this morning. There weren't many blossoms, but it should be enough. She pressed a small bouquet of white jasmine into Jasmine's hand, and Jasmine immediately lifted it to her nose to sniff it. Oh, thank you, Aunt Harriet. Jasmine hugged the older woman tightly. You always know the right things to say and do. She handed her aunt one sprig. Would you put this in my hair for me? Harriet wove the small stem into the bun Jasmine's hair was in. It looks good. She smiled, slipping her arm around her niece's shoulders. I couldn't let you marry without Jasmine. All of her sisters had their flower on their wedding days. There was a greenhouse in Seattle that grew them, and made it easy for them to find their flowers, but Harriet had gone out of her way for these special blossoms. Jasmine clutched her flowers to her chest as she stood in front of the others with Lee at her side. She repeated the words the pastor spoke and then lifted her lips for his kiss. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The kiss was simple and sweet, but Jasmine made sure to reach out her tongue to touch his lips, causing him to smile. The two men transferred her bags, while she hugged her mother and aunt goodbye. "I'll miss you both." Mary shook her head. "You'll be seeing us before we leave." "I need to make sure my baby is still okay." Jasmine smiled. "He's going to take good care of me, Mama." She was certain she'd see her mother many times before the two of them left Monday. "He'd better." Mary walked to the buggy she'd ridden into town in and waited while Eli helped her up. Jasmine stood at the side of Lee's wagon until her family was out of sight. She turned to Lee then, putting her hand on his chest and offering her lips for his kiss. "I'm glad we're married." Lee smiled, kissing her softly. "So am I." He knew he'd be even happier in a few hours when he had her in bed with him. He couldn't believe it had all happened so quickly. "Ew." The word came from the back of the wagon where the twins were sitting in the wagon bed watching them. "Let go of our new ma," Jacob demanded. Lee looked at the boys without letting go of Jasmine. "She may be your new ma, but she's my new wife, and that means I get to touch her." He kissed her again, knowing the boys were watching just to prove his point to them. The drive back to his ranch took over 30 minutes. Jasmine looked around at everything, happy that she would be staying in this beautiful state. When they pulled up to the ranch house, Lee helped her down and grabbed her bag to carry inside. "I'm going to give you a quick tour, and then I need to go and unhitch the wagon." Jasmine followed him to the kitchen where she met Mrs. Banks. "I'm happy to meet you," she told the older woman. "I've heard good things about you." She wanted to be friends with the older woman who would be in her home 5 days per week. Mrs. Banks looked Jasmine up and down. "You're going to need to be a lot stronger than you appear to deal with those boys." Jasmine sighed. "I think the boys are perfect darlings. We'll be fine." She followed Lee from the room as he showed her the other parts of the house. The house was much larger than Eli's, with a parlor and a dining room right outside the kitchen. Their bedroom was on the first floor, but all the others were up. "How many bedrooms are there?" she asked, curious as she looked up the stairs. She wasn't going to go up just yet. She needed to deal with her belongings first. "Just 5, he told her. She nodded. That wasn't too many. The house was larger than her home in Seattle, but not nearly as grand. Thinking about her house in Seattle reminded Jasmine that she'd only brought a few of her things. She would have to remind her mother to ship the rest. She put her bag on the bed in their bedroom and looked around the room. It was spotless. Mrs. Banks did a good job keeping it clean. She smiled when she saw the bed, stroking the covers with her hand. She caught Lee's eye with a smile. "Do you want to show me your bed before you unhitch the team?" she asked. He laughed softly. "The boys are awake. They'll be asleep tonight, and we'll have some time to ourselves." He kissed her, much harder than he had in front of the others. "I can't wait." She smiled. "I can't either." Jasmine unpacked her belongings before going to find what the boys were up to. She wandered through the house, familiarizing herself with it as she searched. They were too far from a school, so she was going to have to teach the boys at home, and she wanted to talk to them about getting started the following day. There was no way she was going to start teaching them on her wedding day. She climbed the stairs, which hadn't been included in the short tour Lee had provided, and looked around. The boys shared one room that was neat and tidy, and there was a pillow with a round indentation at the foot of one of the beds. She looked at it for a moment before smiling. The boys must have a pet. She approved, heartily feeling that pets were good for children, because they taught them how to be responsible. She wondered if they had a cat or a dog. She went to the window of their room and looked out, spotting them outside playing in the dirt. Shaking her head, she realized that mandatory daily baths may be necessary in the house. Jasmine walked back down the stairs to the kitchen and leaned against the work table to talk to Mrs. Banks. She was an older woman with silver hair and a round body. She reminded Jasmine of their cook at home. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Jasmine asked, thinking the best way to get to know the other woman was to work with her in the kitchen. They needed to get along well for the house to run smoothly. "No thank you." Mrs. Banks said nothing else as she continued to wash the dishes she'd dirtied while cooking. Jasmine was thrilled with how clean the kitchen was, and how up-to-date. There was running water, and she'd also noticed water in the bathroom. She'd be living in the lap of luxury after getting used to Eli's house. There was nothing in her new house she hadn't had in Seattle, but she would certainly appreciate it all a lot more now that she had lived without. "Are you certain?" "I enjoy cooking," Jasmine said. A year ago, she would have laughed if anyone had told her she would ever enjoy cooking. Now the careful measuring and kneading were something she truly liked. She couldn't wait to get into her kitchen and cook for her new family. "I'm sure. Why don't you go sit somewhere and do your needlepoint? Isn't that what fine ladies are supposed to do all day?" Jasmine studied the other woman for a moment, wondering why she didn't like her. "I'm sure some ladies do that, but I've been cooking and cleaning my sister's house for months while she was pregnant. I don't mind hard work." Maybe she hadn't done hard work her entire life, but she'd certainly learned a lot about it in the time she'd been in Montana. Daisy had needed her, and she'd done all she could to help. Mrs. Banks shooed her from the kitchen. "Not in this house, that's my job." Jasmine left, wondering what the older woman's problem was. She wasn't trying to take her job. She was thrilled to have someone to help cook and clean while she got down to the serious business of mothering the boys. She also liked the idea of doing some of the housework, though. Maybe on the woman's days off she could feel like the house was actually hers. She walked outside to find the boys in the yard with a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing a pig of all things. Never one to let her imagination run away from her when a direct question would work just as well. She walked up to them. "Why are you washing a pig?" Jacob looked up at her, smiling sweetly. "This is Ham. He's our friend." Jasmine blinked a few times, trying to sort through that answer. "And you bathe all your friends?" They'd named their pig friend Ham? Why did they have a pig friend? Joseph giggled. "Only the ones who are pigs." He looked up at Jasmine. "You don't think we should wash Ham?" "I didn't say that, Joey. Why did you name him Ham?" Ignoring the bathing thing, that was the burning question in her mind. What kind of sick children named their pig friend Ham? "Papa said the only things we were allowed to name him were Ham or Bacon, because that's what he'll be when he grows up, so we chose Ham." Joey shrugged as he said the words. "We love him, though, and Papa will never really make us eat him." Jasmine's eyes widened. The pig was small, still a piglet, but would Lee really eat him? After the boys had obviously gotten attached to him, she hoped not. They didn't seem to bathe themselves often, but they bathed their piglet. "How often do you bathe Ham?" "Every day," Jacob told her. "Papa says pigs are filthy, but not Ham. He can't ever call Ham filthy again." "That's a very valid point." She shrugged, moving on to another subject. "We need to start learning tomorrow. I'm going to look through the lesson books your father left out for me." "Have you had any lessons at all yet?" She didn't know if they knew an A from a Z or a 2 from a 6. She hoped they did, but if they didn't, she'd just start at the very beginning. Joey shook his head, his mop of white blonde hair flying as he did. "Mrs. Banks tried to teach us once, but she told Papa if he ever asked her to sit at the same table with us again, she would leave immediately, and there was no one else for a 100-mile radius who would come work for him." Jacob looked up from scrubbing Ham. "What's a radius?" Jasmine took a deep breath. She wasn't overly fond of the way Mrs. Banks had treated her, and she could already see she didn't like the way she treated the boys. She may have to talk to Lee about replacing the older woman. "We'll talk about that when we do your arithmetic. Starting tomorrow, we're going to do lessons every morning. When we're done, you can play." Both boys nodded slowly, obviously not liking the idea much. "Yes, Ma." Joey was the one to respond so politely. Jacob just stared at her as if she'd grown horns. Try not to get too dirty. We'll be having supper soon. At least she thought they would. Mrs. Banks hadn't exactly been full of helpful information. She hoped she would be better as she got to know her. Jasmine hurried into the house and opened the lesson books. The boys were smart. She made some quick notes on a piece of paper and tucked the papers into the books. There. She would be ready to start teaching them first thing in the morning. As soon as she'd assessed what they knew, of course. She looked around her at the house. There was nothing that needed to be cleaned, and the boys were content bathing him. She needed to find something to do to keep from going crazy. Wandering into the bedroom, she picked up a half-finished apron. She'd still need it, she knew, because Mrs. Banks took 2 days off every single week. Before meeting her, Jasmine had dreaded the days she'd have to do for her family. Now? She was looking forward to them. The sooner the better as far as Jasmine was concerned. She sat down with her sewing in the parlor off the dining room. It was a nice little room that would be good for entertaining. Maybe she could have some ladies from church over for tea one afternoon. She knew that Daisy and her friend, Clara, would both come if no one else. And honestly? That seemed like enough to her at just that moment. Jasmine glanced out the window again, watching as the boys nailed 2 pieces of wood together. She wondered idly what they were making. Maybe a pen for Ham? Or even a treehouse? She smiled at the idea of building a treehouse. Her sister Lily had always been in trees, but Jasmine had never taken the time to climb them. Lily said the view was better from higher up, so she'd always climbed as high as she could. Jasmine looked up as Lee came into the room, sitting beside her on the small sofa and brushing her lips with a soft kiss. I missed you, Jasmine told him. I like it when you touch me. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. The boys weren't there to watch, so she could touch him if she wanted to. He shook his head and laughed softly. Now that we're married, I think you're supposed to tell me that you don't like it when I touch you. At least that's what his first wife had done. How he'd managed to father the boys, he'd never know. Jasmine smiled, pulling his head down for another kiss, this time, touching his lips with the tip of her tongue. I won't lie to you, even if I'm supposed to. Your kisses make me tingle all over. She wound her arms around his neck and brought his head down for another kiss, this time slipping her tongue into his mouth and exploring as he'd taught her. Lee gathered her against him, not willing to push her away again. He loved touching her, and he wasn't about to stop. There was a loud throat clearing from the doorway of the parlor, and he looked up. Is dinner ready, Mrs. Banks? Yes. Her face showed definite signs of disapproval as she looked down at them both. Perhaps she should save that sort of display for the bedroom after the children are in bed? She didn't wait for a response as she turned on her heel and marched back toward the kitchen. Jasmine looked at Lee in wonder. Why do you keep her around? She's so disapproving. She stared after the other woman in shock. Why would anyone pay a woman like that to stay around? Jasmine was thinking about giving her money to go away. Lee sighed. No one else is willing to work here because of the boys. That's ridiculous. The boys are wonderful, why would anyone complain about them? She truly believed the boys just needed to be loved. What more could they ask for in life? He shook his head. Eventually, she would realize that she was being asked to parent hellions. Until then, he'd let her keep her illusions. Are you hungry? Oh yes. Starving. I barely picked up my lunch because I was so nervous about the wedding. I'll do my best not to eat everyone's share. She followed him into the dining room, wondering what Mrs. Banks had cooked. She'd loved the food their cook at home had made, and looked forward to being fed by a woman who cooked for a living again. He sat at the head of the table, and she sat to his right. He looked at her in surprise. You're supposed to sit at the foot of the table. You're my wife. She shrugged. No, thank you. I want to sit close to you. She saw no reason to sit all the way across the table from him where she'd have to raise her voice. She didn't ever want to be that far away from him again. The boys rushed into the room, both with dirt and grime all over their hands, and they sat down at the table. Jasmine looked at them and shook her head. "Clean hands before you eat." She pointed toward the kitchen, letting them know to go there and wash up immediately. Jacob started to protest, but Joey kicked him. "Yes, ma'am." They both trooped into the kitchen to wash their hands. As they left, Jasmine heard Joey say, "It's part of having a ma. We'll get used to being clean." Jasmine's eyes met Lee's as she burst into laughter. "Have I mentioned how wonderful I think the boys are?" She was so happy to finally be a real part of their lives. She felt like she'd waited years to be allowed to live with them all. Lee just shook his head. "I guess someone needs to think that. And that someone is me." Jasmine waited until the boys had both returned, and then looked at Lee. "Are you going to pray for us?" Lee nodded. He and the boys usually just fell on the food as soon as they were all seated, but he knew the right way to do things. All of them bowed their heads for the brief prayer. "Now can we eat?" Jacob asked, obviously annoyed by all the delays. Jasmine took his attitude in stride. "Of course." She picked up a bowl of mashed potatoes and gave each of the boys a generous serving, before adding carrots and meat to their plates. "Enjoy." She added a portion of everything to her own plate while Lee watched her. She took a bite of the mashed potatoes. They were lumpy and tasted like glue. The carrots were terrible, only half cooked and still raw in the center. The pot roast was burnt around the edges. It was easily the worst meal she'd ever eaten in her life. She waited for someone else to mention how awful the food was, but they all ate it like it was normal. She picked at her food, and finally turned to Lee. "Is the food always this bad? How could they all eat it like it?" He frowned down at his food. "This is the best meal she's cooked in weeks." Jasmine shook her head. "I can't let my family eat this way. I'll start cooking tomorrow." None of them would eat another meal that woman had cooked if she could help it. He looked at her, hope filling his eyes. "You work that out with Mrs. Banks." She sighed. "The woman hates me." He shrugged. "Mrs. Banks hates everyone. That's just her way. I'll deal with it tomorrow. Today's my wedding day, and I'm going to only do things that make me happy." She reached over and squeezed his thigh under the table, pretending that she didn't know it was improper. She loved touching him, and it didn't much matter what was proper or improper. He was a good man, and he was hers to do what she wanted with. The boys had no table manners at all. She'd never eaten with them before, and she was a bit startled. She'd start on that tomorrow as well. Tomorrow was going to be a big day. She watched as Jacob used Joey's shirt as a napkin. Really? Not even his own shirt? She made a mental note to add that to their school lessons. After dinner, she cleared the table, seeing that Mrs. Banks had left for the night. She washed the dishes they'd eaten from quickly and put them up. Obviously Mrs. Banks did the dishes she cooked with, and usually did the men's dishes in the morning. Finding her workload eased up some would hopefully make the older woman happy. When she finished the dishes, Jasmine went into the parlor where Lee sat with the boys, talking to them. She saw by the clock on the mantel that it was only 7. She was disappointed. She wanted to get the boys to bed so she could begin her wedding night. He had no excuses for not letting her see his chest tonight. Instead, she settled down on the couch next to Lee and listened as he read from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. She'd read it before, but she always loved to hear it. Chapter 4. As Lee read aloud, Jasmine moved closer to him on the sofa, and watched the boys. They were stacking wooden blocks on the floor, and she knew they wouldn't notice her. She put her hand on Lee's thigh, rubbing his hard muscle through his pants. She liked the way he felt. How would he look without his pants covering his muscles? Lee jumped a bit, but he continued reading, not saying anything. Jasmine smiled. She wondered what she could do that would break his concentration without the boys noticing. Her smile filled her face at the game she devised to play. She put her head on Lee's shoulder, kissing him gently through the flannel of his shirt, her hand still caressing his thigh. When that didn't make him falter, she gently bit his shoulder, letting him feel her teeth through the fabric. She used her free hand to pull his shirt from his pants, and slid her hand under his shirt, rubbing it over the hard muscles of his stomach. He worked hard every day, and she could feel it in his muscles. She stroked her hand up to feel the dusting of hair on his chest, liking how it felt between her fingers. She explored a little more, finding his tiny nipple and pinching it lightly. Her eyes traveled to his face, and although he'd not faltered in his reading, his face was turning red. She smiled, knowing she was getting to him. He finished the chapter he was reading and jumped up. "Time for bed, boys." He looked at Jasmine, his eyes glazed. "Why don't you get ready for bed as well, dear?" Lee wasn't going to wait any longer. As soon as the boys were tucked into bed, he was going to pounce on her. Not that he thought she'd complain at all. "I'll do just that." She walked slowly away from him, making sure her hips swayed under her full skirt, because she knew he had his attention on her and nothing else. When she got to the bedroom door, she turned around and looked at him, mouthing the word, "Hurry." Lee grabbed each boy by the hand and dragged them up the stairs. "Hurry and change and I'll tuck you in." "What's wrong, Papa?" Joey asked. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just tired." He wasn't at all tired. He hadn't felt so alive in years. His pants were stretched tight over his erection, and he wasn't sure he could wait to get to his new wife. What was she thinking acting that way while the boys were still up? He'd have to have a talk with her about her behavior. After. Jasmine waited until she could hear their footsteps on the stairs, before she let the giggle escape her. She quickly undressed and folded her clothes neatly. She opened the drawer she'd put her nightgowns into, stared down at them, and closed it. She didn't need a nightgown tonight. She climbed under the covers, carefully leaving one shoulder bare as she lay on her side waiting for him to join her. How long would it take to put the boys to bed? Not long, apparently. She could hear his footsteps on the stairs just moments later. He knocked on the door, and when she didn't respond quickly enough he opened it, his eyes scanning the room for his new bride. The lanterns were both still lit, and she was lying under the covers. Judging by the bare shoulder, he could see she was completely naked. Dear Lord, let him be able to wait until she found her pleasure. He wasn't sure if it was possible, but he would do his very best. He'd never wanted anything in his life as much as he wanted Jasmine at that moment. All the teasing touches while he was reading had driven him wild. Not that he hadn't been wild for her before. Their buggy ride had let him know in no uncertain terms how she would feel about physical intimacy. How had he lived his life without a woman like this beside him? He quickly shucked off his clothes while she watched. A more modest woman would turn her head away, but she seemed to think he was undressing, just to put on a show for her. He hoped she never changed. After removing his belt, he debated whether he should take his pants off with her watching the way she was or leave them on for later. He moved his hands to the buttons at the front of his pants, to see if she'd turn away, but she didn't. His little bride sat up in bed instead, keeping the quilt over her breasts, but just barely. She wanted to see him, and she didn't have a problem showing it. He shook his head for a moment as his shaking hands unbuttoned the front placket of his pants, and he pushed his pants down and to the floor, stepping out of them, like he wasn't at all embarrassed of his nudity. He was, though. No woman had ever looked at him that way. Gloria had always kept her eyes closed while he undressed. How could he have married two women who were such opposites? He stalked toward the bed, where she was laying right smack in the middle. He would be close to her, whichever side he chose to take as his own. He came down onto the bed, sitting facing her. Jasmine's eyes were glued to his erection, staring at it with wide eyes. "Is it going to fit?" she asked as her hand reached out to stroke it. His hand moved quickly, and he caught her wrist before she could touch him. "That's not a good idea right now." He didn't want to finish before they even started. His new wife would not be happy with him. Jasmine pouted. "But I want to see what it feels like. I've never touched one." Surely he could understand her curiosity. He shook his head. "You can feel it later. Not now." Would she always be this bold? He certainly hoped so. Jasmine sighed. I can touch your chest now, though, right? Lee couldn't believe how aggressive his little virgin bride was being. She certainly didn't hold back anything. Only if I can touch yours. She grinned, and moved her arms a bit to let the quilt that was covering her breasts drop down. Be my guest. She knew she was probably supposed to be shy about her body, but she knew he was interested in her, so why should she pretend something that wasn't there? His eyes went to the small perfect globe she'd uncovered. He leaned down and licked one of her nipples, feeling her jump in surprise. Very pretty, he murmured as he caught it between his lips and suckled her. She wound one hand through his hair and used the other to reach down and pet his chest. Her fingers found his nipple and she pinched as she had in the parlor and heard him groan around her nipple. I can't believe you did that with the boys right there. He sat up to look directly into her eyes. What if they had seen? She had no sense of propriety at all, and he couldn't decide if he was upset about it or thrilled. I had a story all planned out if they noticed. Her eyes went to his lips. Are you going to kiss me? She licked her bottom lip to moisten it as she stared at his. He couldn't resist leaning forward and kissing her passionately. She wrapped her arms around his back and stroked his shoulders. What was it about this woman that made her so comfortable with her sensuality? He stroked her breasts while he kissed her before abruptly moving the blanket from between them. I don't want to be separated from you, even by a blanket, he said. She smiled, moving closer to him and feeling him thrusting against her belly. That feels so good, she moaned. When was he going to do what Daisy had talked about? Wasn't it time yet? He kissed her again while one hand moved down between her thighs, testing her readiness for him. He hoped she was ready, because with all the teasing she'd done, he needed to be inside her soon. He pulled back for a moment to watch her face as his fingers probed. Does that hurt? She shook her head. But that's not what's supposed to go there. Daisy said it was your man part that goes there. He had to know how it was supposed to work, though. He'd been married before. I'm just making sure you're ready. He added one more finger, carefully moving them inside her. When she let out a moan of pleasure, he knew he didn't have to worry. Lay down. He moved back to give her room to stretch out on her back on the bed. She shook her head. No. I liked how it felt when I was sitting on your lap in the wagon the other night. We can do it that way, can't we? Daisy had said they could when she'd questioned her, but she didn't tell him that. It was none of his business how her sister and her husband were with each other. He swallowed hard. With Gloria, it had always been with him on top and her on her back. She'd always turned her head away, and pretended it wasn't happening. It had made him self-conscious about making love. He slowly nodded, moving to where his back was against the headboard. Like this? He asked. She nodded, crawling toward him. She carefully straddled his lap, kissing him again. I have no idea what I'm doing, so you're going to have to help me. How had she become the aggressor? His little bride was anything but shy. He'd expected her to be at least a little embarrassed once their clothes came off, but not Jasmine. She was ready to throw him down and figure it out for herself if that's what it took. He cupped her hips in his hands and pulled her over him, positioning himself at her entrance. It's going to hurt a little, he warned her as he held her poised, thrusting at her entrance. I know, she whispered, leaning forward to kiss him. He took advantage of her distraction with the kiss and thrust upward, breaching her maidenhead and burying himself inside her. She gasped against his mouth, shocked at the feeling of fullness, but not feeling the overwhelming pain her mother had led her to believe would be there. She pulled away and looked into his eyes. You're inside me. Her voice sounded half surprised at the fact that he was actually making love with her. He smiled. I am. Are you okay? She nodded. It feels strange, but good. I think I like it. She leaned forward again to kiss him. Her hands going to his shoulders as she wiggled her hips a little to see how it would feel. Lee took over then, thrusting inside her, praying he could hold out until she finished. Being Jasmine, she moaned loudly, the noises filling the room. Thank God the boys slept upstairs. He kissed her again, trying to keep her quiet enough that she wouldn't wake the twins. His hands kneaded her soft breasts as she rode him. She felt something tightening in her belly, and she let out a loud moan that was captured by his lips as she tightened around him. She collapsed against him, feeling as if she could never move again. Lee couldn't wait another moment. He groaned deeply as he emptied his seed into her waiting body, holding her tightly against him. He closed his eyes, burying his face in her neck, as he breathed in great gulps of air. He wasn't certain he would ever recover from her. He wasn't certain he ever wanted to. Jasmine sighed contentedly against his throat. She wiggled a little, feeling him still inside her, but smaller now. That was nice. Can we do it again? He laughed softly. Only you, Jasmine. He lifted her face for his kiss. Yes, we will do it again, and we'll do it often. Not right this second though. He helped her off him and down onto one side of the bed, laying down beside her and pulling her into his arms. Jasmine grinned happily. I liked that a lot. She kissed his chin. When can we do it again? She'd made the smart choice by marrying him. She knew it then. How could she have ever thought of doing anything else? It's going to be an hour or two. Go to sleep. We're going to have to rest between rounds or I'll never be able to work again. She giggled. Do you want to work? She stroked her hand along his belly. Really? Lee shook his head. I'd rather stay in bed with you all the time. He pulled her even closer, holding her tightly. The boys would be scandalized. She giggled at the idea of never leaving the bed. We could tell them we both have the plague and we don't want to make them sick, he suggested with a grin. You know? I think that's a brilliant idea. Her hand stroked his chest and down over his body, going to the part of him she'd wanted to touch earlier. It's soft. He nodded. For now. That's why we have to wait. He closed his eyes with a smile, content that she was in his arms, and so willing. What was the story you had ready for the boys anyway? Jasmine yawned. I was going to tell them my hands were cold and you were warming me up. He grinned and pressed a kiss to her forehead. She sighed, closing her eyes. She knew she'd wake up later and they'd do it all over again. Could she have picked a more perfect man to marry? Her life would be wonderful now. Her life was utter chaos. What had she been thinking marrying a man with 7-year-old twin boys with a penchant for mischief? She'd gotten up early, her thighs more than a little tender, and gone to the kitchen to make breakfast. She'd heard an oink behind her, only to see him eating out of a bowl of scraps right there in the kitchen. She'd let out a low scream surprised at finding him in the house, and the pig had run from the kitchen and up the stairs, obviously going to the boys' bedroom. She closed her eyes and counted to 10 breathing deeply. There would be no pigs in her house. None. The boys would understand. When they woke up, she'd tell them that Hem needed a pen to live in. There was no reason for him to stay in the house. He would be happier outside with the other animals. Why had Lee allowed a pig in the house, even if he was bathed daily? She cut up some potatoes to fry and made bacon and eggs as well. The bacon made her wrinkle her nose. Would Hem be on her plate someday? If he kept coming in the house, she'd make sure of it. By the time Mrs. Banks arrived, Jasmine had breakfast cooked and the dishes half done. Won't you have breakfast with us, Mrs. Banks? Jasmine hoped the older woman would say no, because she had no desire to eat with her, but she needed to at least offer. The older woman glared at her as she looked around the clean kitchen. It's my job to cook for this family. Jasmine sighed. I was trying to help you. Now that there's an extra person here, your chores will be heavier. Why don't you let me do all the cooking, and you can do the cleaning? She did her best to offer the solution in a way the older woman wouldn't take offense to. Do you have a problem with my cooking? Jasmine looked at the older woman for a moment, afraid to offend her, but refusing to lie. I prefer my own. There, that was honest and not at all rude. She was proud of herself for coming up with the answer. Mrs. Banks's eyes widened with surprise. Fine. Do all the cooking then. I won't help with it at all. Jasmine smiled. Thank you. I appreciate your understand. She put the last dish away before going to wake the boys. She was thrilled to be told to do all the cooking after tasting the other woman's food the previous night. There was no way she was going to let her continue to cook for her sweet family. She climbed the stairs and went into their room, seeing him settled on the pillow at the foot of Jacob's bed. Why had they been allowed to keep a pig in the house? What was wrong with their father? Joey, Jacob. Time to get up. I made breakfast. Both boys sat up in their beds rubbing their eyes. Breakfast? I made bacon and eggs and fried potatoes. How does that sound? She hoped the boys liked eggs, but she'd soon find out. If they could eat Mrs. Banks's cooking, they were obviously willing to eat just about anything. They jumped up. We usually just have toast for breakfast, Joey told her, rushing to get dressed. Hurry down. She left their room, closing the door behind them. Toast for breakfast every morning? She was going to have to make a lot of changes. She opened the door to her own bedroom and saw Lee still face down, sprawled across the bed. Lee. I made breakfast. He rolled to his side and looked at her. The sun wasn't even up yet, and she'd kept him awake half the night with her shenanigans. Why was she up? Breakfast? Yes, breakfast. Fried potatoes, eggs and bacon. He bounded out of bed, kissing her distractedly as he pulled on his pants and shirt. You made it? Not Mrs. Banks? Jasmine chuckled. Yes, I made it. He rushed from the room to go sit at the table, which she'd already set. She carried in 2 platters with the food on them and placed them on the table. I found a bucket of milk on the work table in the kitchen when I got up. Do you want milk? They all 3 nodded, and she poured milk for them. Who brought the milk? She asked. Who had come into their house while they were sleeping? Oh, one of the ranch hands milks the cows and brings in the eggs every morning. Lee was so busy serving himself he didn't even look at her as he answered her question. Oh. Eli had ranch hands, but he had milked the cows himself. She took her seat beside him. Don't forget to pray for us, Lee. Lee stared down at the feast on his plate and closed his eyes, said a quick prayer, and took his first bite of food. This is excellent. The boys were shoveling the food into their mouths so quickly she was surprised they didn't choke. I'm glad you like it, she said warily as they continued to stuff their faces. All 3 of them needed to learn table manners. She had her work cut out for her. She ate 1 egg, a few pieces of potatoes, and a strip of bacon. She'd never been much of a breakfast eater, but she knew it was an important meal for most people. Lee took 2 helpings, and when he'd polished off the second, he looked at the platters in disappointment. I had no idea you were such a good cook. Both boys nodded enthusiastically as they ate their last few bites. Good food, Jacob said with his mouth full of egg and potatoes. Great, Joey agreed as he wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Jasmine had placed napkins at each place setting, hoping they'd use them, but none of them even seemed to realize they were there. I'll be sure to make more tomorrow. Lee looked at her with surprise. You're going to make breakfast again tomorrow? She nodded. I'm going to cook 3 meals a day every day. She smiled at the enthusiasm all 3 of them showed for her cooking. He used his sleeve to wipe his mouth, showing her where the boys had learned the habit. Have you told Mrs. Banks? Jasmine nodded. I don't have to clear what meals I cook with the housekeeper, but yes, I did tell her. She knows that I prefer my own cooking, and I'll be handling all the meals from now on. He choked on the milk he was drinking. You told her you prefer your own cooking. She shrugged. Well, I do. She gestured to the table where there was not 1 tiny bit of food left. Apparently you all do as well. Joey looked at the table, suddenly upset. What's Ham going to eat? Jasmine closed her eyes, trying to keep her temper calm. Ham is going to start living in the pen with the other pigs. He's not a house pet. Pigs do not sleep on pillows in little boys' rooms. Jacob glared at her. Ham likes sleeping in our room. He gets cold and scared at night with the other pigs. We wash him every day, so he's clean. I'm your new ma, right? Both boys nodded. Yes, Joey slumped as he agreed. That means this is my house, right? Jacob stared down at the table. Yes. Then there will be no pigs living in it. Now take your plates into the kitchen and place them in the basin. Jasmine wanted a minute along with their father to talk to him about allowing pigs to live in the house, but Mrs. Banks clears the table. Joey protested. You will put your plates in the basin. Thank you. She turned to Lee and spoke to him softly. Why was there a pig in my kitchen when I went to make breakfast this morning? What were you thinking to allow them to have a pig for a pet? Lee sighed. Probably not my best parenting decision. The boys wanted him so badly, and they kept on me until I agreed. He shrugged. Since they wash him every day, he's not dirty. You know better than that. Jasmine shook her head at him. No more barnyard animals as pets. They may have a puppy or a kitten, but nothing else. Do you understand me? How could he have thought that was a good idea to start with? Lee took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing it softly. I do understand. He pulled her from her chair into his lap. I can't wait until the boys go to bed. She shook her head. You're not going to get around me that easily, Lee Fields. He pulled her face down for a kiss, his tongue tangling with hers. There was a loud door slam from behind them. Startled, they pulled apart to see Mrs. Banks glaring at them. I'll not keep walking in on this kind of behavior. You two need to remember it's daylight. Jasmine giggled as she buried her face in Lee's neck. She wondered what the woman would say if she told her she'd made Lee get up to light the light all 3 times they'd woken and made love during the night. She'd be shocked. Yes, ma'am. Her words were mumbled against her husband's neck. Lee gently pushed her from his lap and stood up. I need to get to work. I'll be back at noon for lunch. Jasmine nodded. I'll have something waiting for you. She thought about what she'd seen in the kitchen earlier while she quickly cleared the table and went in search of the boys. She needed to get started on their schooling right away. Chapter 5. Jasmine spent 2 hours teaching the boys which letters and numbers were which before she switched to table manners. When you eat, you will use a napkin to wipe your mouth. Not your sleeve and not your brother's shirt. A napkin. She held up the napkin she'd left on the table to show them what she meant. She wasn't certain either one of them had ever used a napkin. Why? Jacob asked. It took Jasmine a moment to realize he wasn't being insolent. He genuinely didn't understand why she thought he should use a napkin. Because it's polite, and it saves your shirt from having to be washed. But then you have to wash the napkin, Joey protested. It was all Jasmine could do not to laugh at that argument. But napkins are smaller and easier to wash. And you don't have to have as many clothes if you don't get them as dirty, so then you can spend more money on toys. Both boys sat up straighter when she said that. We'll use napkins, Joseph told her. They seemed eager to do as she asked when it came right down to it. Now, let's talk about table manners. What should you have in your mouth when you talk? She asked. They looked at each other. Only white food? Joey guessed. She shook her head. Only meat? Jacob was grasping at straws. Neither of them had any clue what they were doing wrong. You should have your tongue and your teeth in your mouth when you talk. Nothing else. She sighed. This morning at breakfast, you were spraying food all over each other because your mouths were so full while you were talking. That's bad? Joey asked. Jasmine nodded. It's very impolite. We need to work on keeping our mouths shut while we chew. No one should see the food in your mouths. Jacob looked at Joey and sighed. Having a ma is going to be a lot of work. Jacob said the words with a long-suffering sigh. It was obvious he would do it, but he wouldn't be terribly willing. That's enough school for today. You two go and play. Lunch will be ready in a few minutes. She'd started baking bread before sitting down with them that morning, and she had a huge pot of beans cooking on the stove. Mrs. Banks was nowhere to be found as Jasmine went about her tasks in the kitchen. She pulled a loaf of bread from the oven and smiled at the aroma. Perfect. There was a small crock with a bit of butter left in it, but Jasmine could see that she would need to add making butter to her list. Yesterday, she'd worried there would be nothing for her to do with a housekeeper there. Now she saw she would have work to do as long as she felt up to doing it. Lee held her hand while they ate their lunch, and the boys did their best to only use their napkins and eat with their mouths closed. When Lee lifted his arm to wipe his mouth with his sleeve, Jasmine caught it and pressed a napkin into his hand, nodding toward the boys. She wanted him to set a good example for his sons. He nodded, carefully using the napkin on his mouth before setting it back down on the table. Jasmine was surprised when every bit of food was once again devoured. She'd only learned to cook a few months before while helping Daisy, but apparently she was still a much better cook than Mrs. Banks. She cleared the table after the meal, but got shooed out of the way when she started doing the dishes. Jasmine nodded with a smile. She'd happily do the cooking and allow the other woman to wash the dishes. Whether Mrs. Banks knew it or not, they were already learning to deal with each other. She found the cream and the butter churn and set about making butter that afternoon. As soon as she had it in crocks covered by a cloth, she went out into the yard to check on the boys. They'd been so quiet she worried they were into mischief. She found them in the pig pen with Ham, staring at him with sad looks on their faces. What's wrong? They looked so forlorn, she was worried about them. Ham doesn't like living with pigs. He likes living with people, Jacob told her. He's a pig. He likes other pigs. Jasmine wasn't going to fall for that nonsense. If they wanted an unacceptable pet, they needed to find one small enough to live in a bucket like she had. He's going to get cold sleeping outside, Joey complained. He'll be fine. Jasmine shook her head at them. They obviously loved their pig. She went back to the house and settled down to work on some mending she found. She'd need to ask Lee to take her to town the next day so she could get some staples. The boys were both outgrowing their Sunday best clothes, and Lee could use a new dress shirt. There was a lot to do to make up for the fact that there hadn't been a woman in the house for years. She wondered where their clothes had come from over the years, but decided not to ask. She didn't want to hear any more stories of nurses that were in and out of their lives. At dinner that evening, both boys did their best to be mannerly. When Lee used his sleeve to wipe his mouth, Jasmine pushed his napkin toward him, nodding at the boys. When he wiped his mouth with his napkin, both boys imitated him. Jasmine wondered if he realized the kind of influence he had over his sons. After dinner, she did the dishes, knowing that Mrs. Banks would prefer she left them for her in the morning, but surely the older woman could see why she felt the need to do them. She couldn't leave that kind of mess in her kitchen overnight. Besides, Mrs. Banks had done all of the pots and pans, leaving her with only the dishes on the table to do. After dinner, she joined Lee and the boys in the parlor again, but this time she worked on the mending she'd found. When he went upstairs to tuck the boys into bed, she slipped into their room to undress. When he walked into the room, she was waiting on top of the covers fully naked, watching for him. He needed to get used to the fact that when he finished the rest of his chores for the day, it would be time to deal with his wife. She needed him as much as the boys did. Lee drove them into town the following day and stood with the boys while she shopped for the things she needed. She made a small mountain on the counter with her numerous purchases, but he never said a word. She bought fabric for 2 new aprons and for clothes for both of the boys. She even bought white linen so she could make a new dress shirt for Lee to wear to church on Sundays. When she was finished, Lee paid for her purchases and carried them to the wagon for her. After helping her up, he asked, "Do you want to eat at the restaurant before we go home?" She contemplated that for a moment. She loved the idea of not having to have the cold lunch she'd planned, but she was worried the boys would embarrass her with their terrible manners. Finally, she nodded. That would be nice. He led her into the restaurant, and followed the waitress to a table. Jasmine looked at the boys and smiled. "Remember your manners while we're here." "Yes, ma'am," they chorused. Jasmine was surprised that all 3 of them had much better manners than they displayed at home. She was proud of how the meal went and smiling happily during the drive back to the ranch. Just as they pulled up into the yard, Daisy drove up from the other direction, their mother, aunt, and Dinah along with them. Jasmine waited while Lee helped her down, before running over to the buggy to greet her family. Mary looked Jasmine over as soon as Lee helped her down. "Are you all right?" Jasmine smiled. "Yes, Mama, I'm just fine. I have a wonderful husband and 2 sweet sons." She would have been exasperated with her mother if she hadn't expected her to come by to check on her. Lee helped both Daisy and Harriet down before he carried in the supplies with the boys' help. "I'll be working." "Dinner around 5?" he asked, kissing her on the forehead. Jasmine nodded. "That sounds good to me." She led her family into the house, wondering what she could make them for a snack to go with the tea. She hadn't had the time to make cookies or a cake yet, so she settled them in the parlor before going into the kitchen to search for something that would pass as a treat. She settled on jam on the bread she'd made the day before, and made small triangles out of them, placing the treats carefully on a tray along with a fresh pot of tea. She carried the laden tray into the parlor and set it on a small table in the corner of the room, before serving each of them. Finally she settled down in an overstuffed chair. "I'm glad you came to visit me," she said. "You're my first visitors here." Mary smiled at her. "It's a beautiful house. I'm so pleased to see you have an indoor bathroom as well as a housekeeper. You grew up with the luxuries, and you shouldn't have to do without as a married woman." She glanced at Daisy, letting her know she still didn't approve of her not having a housekeeper. Daisy ignored her as usual. She'd spent a lot of time trying to please her mother for years, but in the past year or so, since she'd married Eli. Jasmine laughed, shaking her head. "I don't care about the luxuries, Mama. I'm just glad I married a good man whom I care about, and have 2 sweet little boys. Their manners need help, of course, but I love them." She didn't add that a lot of things about the boys needed help, but she thought it. "I have my work cut out for me." "Do you think you'll be able to teach them manners?" Daisy asked. "I've heard some horror stories about things those 2 get up to." Jasmine shrugged. "I can handle them. They just need to be taught." She was more than confident in her abilities. Jacob and Joey sat beneath the open window where they were unashamedly eavesdropping on the new stepmother and her family. At Jasmine's words, they exchanged a glance and moved away to a place they wouldn't be overheard. "Did you hear that?" Joey asked, obviously upset. Jacob nodded. "She wants to change us. She doesn't think we're good enough to be her sons." Joey crossed his arms over his chest. "We'll show her." "How do you think she feels about frogs?" Jacob grinned and nodded. "Let's give her a good welcome." Jasmine went to sleep that night with a smile on her face. She had done the right thing by marrying Lee. His boys were a delight, and everything was falling into place. Even her mother had been pleased with her new home and how well-behaved the boys were. If her mother didn't complain, then her life must be perfect. When Jasmine woke the following morning, she couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her sweet boys. She walked to the basin to wash her hands before cooking breakfast and found 3 frogs living in the inch of water in the bottom of it. She knew she'd spilled it out the previous night, so those frogs were not there by mistake. She carefully put them in a bowl with a plate over the top so they could not hop away. She could see she'd need them soon. As she finished that, she heard an oink from behind her, and she spun around to find him rooting in his food bowl. A food bowl that had yesterday been in the pig pen. She carried the food bowl outside and shooed the pig out, before cooking breakfast. Her boys had decided to make her a victim, but she had never been a victim, and she never would. Her mind was already working on the best way to deal with the boys. She smiled sweetly and pretending nothing had happened as they ate their breakfast, and she didn't react at all when she moved to sit in her spot at the table to teach them, even though she had to first push a pile of tacks on the floor to keep from sitting on them. All day, there were little things the boys did to try to make her jump or scream, but nothing worked. Did they not realize they were trying to prank a master? After the boys were in bed that evening, she looked at Lee. "I need to stay up a little later. There are a couple of things I need to do after the boys go to sleep." Lee raised an eyebrow at her, but didn't ask any questions. He followed her 10 minutes later when she filled a bucket full of water and placed it on the top of their door so it would dump on whichever boy opened it first. He even watched as she took a bowl with a plate over it and removed 4 tiny snakes and dropped them in the boys' boots. When she took the frogs and put them in the bucket the boys used to slop the hogs before breakfast every morning, he realized he was dealing with a true genius. She followed all that up by going into the bathroom and rubbing soap on their toothbrushes. He followed her into the bedroom where they both quickly shucked off their clothes and threw them on the floor. Every evening was a little worse for Jasmine. Her passion was stronger and stronger, and she hated waiting until the boys were in bed. She'd done what she needed to do as a parent first, though, and she was proud of herself for taking her responsibilities seriously. Jasmine was up even earlier than usual the following morning, wanting to be certain to hear if the boys got up to try to play practical jokes on her. She'd kept quiet about the ones they'd played on her, as if they'd never happened, so they shouldn't be expecting anything. Sure enough, 30 minutes before they usually woke, she heard a loud crash and yells from upstairs, and she smiled, wondering which boy had been hit with the bucket. She flipped the bacon in the pan as she heard screams of snake, and knew they'd tried to put their boots on. "Good morning," she greeted them as she waited for them to pick up their pail to slop the hogs with the leftover food from the previous day. Their screams let her know they'd found the frogs. She smiled contentedly. She was a good parent after all. When they all sat down to breakfast, the boys were looking at her with true reverence in their eyes. She knew they understood the pranks she'd played on them were meant to send a message, and as fellow pranksters, they understood her message loud and clear. They would never again try to prank their new mother, because she would get them much better than they'd ever dream of getting her. Halfway through the meal, Joey looked at Jasmine. "Will you teach us how to set the bucket?" He was referring to the bucket above his doorway. Jasmine shook her head. "No, I won't." "And you'll never mess with me again, will you?" The boys exchanged a look, and Lee remained silent. He obviously understood that the little battle taking place in his house was not any of his affair, and he needed to stay out of it. "No, ma'am," Jacob said. "There will be no more pigs in my kitchen in the morning, will there?" Jasmine skewered the boys with her eyes, making certain they knew she meant business. Both boys shook their heads. "We wouldn't dream of it," Joey answered for them both. "Good, because if it does happen again, we'll be having ham for dinner." The boys looked at each other, obviously understanding her meaning. "You wouldn't," Jacob protested. Jasmine took a bite of bacon, closing her eyes as she savored the taste. "Don't you just love bacon? I think it's the tastiest meat there is." The smile didn't leave her face as she slowly chewed. Both boys understood her meaning and jumped up to run outside. Jasmine smiled as she took a sip of her milk. Lee looked at her in surprise. "But they saw ham this morning when they slopped the pigs, didn't they?" She shook her head with a smile. "He was tied up behind the pigsty. They wouldn't have seen him." Both boys came back into the house and sat down at the table, looking greatly relieved. "We promise there will never be a pig in the house again," Joey told her, his eyes all but worshipping her. "See that there isn't." She stood to clear the table, knowing Mrs. Banks would be there any moment to start the breakfast dishes. She wondered if the older woman would be in a foul mood again today. After she'd left the room, Joey leaned forward. "You wouldn't let her feed us ham, would you, Papa?" Lee shrugged. "She's in charge of food around here, and she's your mother. I hope you can find a way to obey her and not cause problems that would make her want to fix ham for dinner." He needed the boys to know that he fully supported Jasmine in whatever she did. She was their new mother, and she was going to be a part of their lives forever. Both boys sat back, realizing they were going to have to behave, because they would get no help from their father. The day went much smoother than the previous day. Neither of them tried to play any jokes on Jasmine, and she thought they'd gotten enough. She wouldn't do anything like that again as long as the boys didn't give her cause to. She made sure everyone bathed that night so they could go to church the following morning. She would see her mother and aunt for the last time before they headed back to Seattle. Jasmine was nervous as she rode with Lee and the twins to church the following morning. Her family would be joining them for lunch at the restaurant before they left town that afternoon, and she was both excited to be going to church with her new family, and nervous that people would think she wasn't good enough to be with Lee and his boys. On the way there, she talked to them about what she expected from their behavior. During church you will sit still and pay attention to the pastor, right? She emphasized the last word, making it clear that she expected their agreement. They both nodded, each of them still nervous about what she'd done the previous day. And you will both be on your best behavior before and after church. I don't want to hear about you playing practical jokes on anyone in the congregation. Do you understand me? Yes, Ma, they chorused together, knowing she meant business. Jasmine turned back around in her seat and smiled at her husband. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? It took everything Lee had inside him not to laugh. His sweet little bride was an absolute hellion, and he couldn't imagine anyone else who would be able to parent his boys half as well. Once they were at church, she took her spot in the front pew. We always sit at the back, Lee protested. I always have to drag at least one boy out of church by his ear. He was certain Jasmine wasn't thinking about his boy's behavior when she chose the front pew. Jasmine smiled sweetly. Not this morning. She turned and saw Daisy heading toward her with Dinah in her arms. She held out her arms for the baby. She's getting so big. As soon as the baby was placed in her arms, Jasmine snuggled Dinah to her. Daisy grinned at her younger sister. How's it going with the terrible twosome? Jasmine grinned. Let's just say they decided to start a prank war with me. She knew her sister would understand immediately how crazy the boys had been for that. Daisy giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. Are they still standing? She looked around for the boys and finally spotted them at the back of the church. They look all right to me. Jasmine laughed. I don't think they'll be trying that again anytime soon. Mary shook her head. You girls have gotten awfully close in the last few months. Maybe we should send Hyacinth out here. Something has to draw that girl out of her shell. Daisy wrinkled her nose at her mother. Hyacinth isn't shy, though, Mama. No, she's not, but I swear she doesn't know what's going on around her. It's gotten even worse since Jasmine left. She keeps walking into walls. Jasmine giggled, because she could see her sister doing that with no problem. That's just how Hyacinth is, Mama. Hyacinth had always been that way. Mary ignored Jasmine. Where are those sweet new grandsons of mine? Jasmine nodded toward the back of the church. We're all sitting together. You'll see them as soon as the service starts. She started to ask her mother if she would help her with them, but decided against it. If she could handle them at home, she could handle them at church. Mary smiled as she watched the boys. They are going to love their cousins. Jasmine and Daisy exchanged a look. Now that she was married, the boys were perfect, because Mary was now their grandmother. After service that morning, Jasmine was surrounded by the ladies of the church, all of them wanting to welcome her to the congregation or wish her luck with the boys. She got a great deal of compliments on their behavior that morning, because they'd sat still at the front of the church, for once, acting as if they were actually listening to what the preacher had to say. Finally, she looked over at Lee and he walked toward her, offering his arm as they left the church. The boys were good this morning, he said with surprise in his tone. Of course, they were. Jasmine had no doubt that she'd be able to get the boys to behave quickly, and she'd been right. She understood the twins in a way no other woman ever would. As they approached the wagon, Lee slipped his arm around her waist and leaned down to nuzzle her neck. Maybe we should send the boys home with your sister after lunch, he whispered. It's Mrs. Banks's day off. Jasmine grinned up at him, loving that idea. There was never enough time for her to be alone with her new husband. No wonder people said starting a marriage when one or both of you already had children was harder. Lee helped her up into the wagon, kissing her hand as he backed away. Jasmine tried to warn him just as he bumped into a petite woman with blonde hair that she'd never seen before. Excuse me, he said as he turned around with a laugh stuck in his throat. As he looked into the face of the woman he'd almost knocked over, he felt the blood drain from his face. Gloria? It couldn't be. She was dead. She had been for 7 years. Hello, Lee. Chapter 6. Jasmine stared down at the woman who was apparently her husband's wife. What on earth was going on? That woman was supposed to have been dead and buried years before. What was she doing there? She wasn't ready to hear any explanations. She felt her perfect world crashing down around her. Jumping down from the wagon without help, she walked to where the boys were sitting on the wagon bed. "Come on, boys. We'll walk to the restaurant." She didn't wait for Lee to say anything, because he seemed to have been rendered speechless. She took the boys by their hands and marched them down the street to the restaurant where she was meeting her family. She wasn't going to stand around and watch while Lee talked to his wife. Lee stared into the face of a ghost. If Gloria hadn't died 7 years before, where had she been all this time? He was vaguely aware of Jasmine gathering the boys and going on to the restaurant, and he made a mental note to thank her for getting them away from the situation. She always seemed to know the right thing to do. "Lee? I've missed you." Gloria smiled up at him as if it had only been a week since they'd seen one another. She looked much the same as she had the last time he'd seen her over 7 years before. He stared at her in disbelief. "You missed me? How about our boys? Did you miss them? They're 7 now, and they'd believed their entire lives that their mother was dead." How could she stand in front of him acting as if everything was right with the world when she'd abandoned them? How could any mother abandon their 3-month-old sons? What was wrong with her that she wasn't ashamed? Gloria had the grace to look embarrassed. "Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive." She smiled at him sweetly, reaching out to touch his arm. He jerked away from her. "I'm a married man." As he said the words, his heart fell. Was he really a married woman? He'd married Jasmine, but didn't that really make him a bigamist? Was that even legal in Montana? "Yes, you are. You're married to me." She shook her head. "Who was that red-headed whore you were just with?" "The woman I thought was my wife," he yelled. He took deep breaths trying to calm his temper. This woman abandoned his family and now she was back and had the audacity to call his new wife a whore. Jasmine loved the boys in a way Gloria had never dreamed of loving anyone but herself. Gloria backed up a step, and Lee was struck by how very different this woman was from Jasmine. If he'd ever yelled at Jasmine, she'd have taken a step toward him, not away, and gone toe-to-toe with him until he backed down. "Well, I guess you were mistaken," she said in a small voice. "Why would you marry someone else?" Lee took a deep gulping breath, doing his best to control his temper. He'd thought this woman was normal? She wasn't. He'd learned that real women have passion and feelings. It wasn't until that moment that he realized he loved Jasmine with everything inside him. How could he not? "I married Jasmine because I love her. She's a good mother for our boys." She was the mother Gloria never could have been. He had a sudden absurd urge to kneel at the feet of this woman and thank her for leaving. She'd made all their lives so much better when she'd abandoned them. "I'm the boy's mother, not some random floozy who steals other women's husbands." Gloria shook her head as if she couldn't believe he would talk about Jasmine as if she were a good person. "Where have you been, Gloria?" he asked, his voice filled with sadness. She didn't even realize that she was in the wrong. It was as if she thought she'd done the right thing by running off, no matter what kind of bind he was left in. "I don't know what you mean." Gloria backed away another step, obviously afraid of the look on his face. "You left my house 7 years ago and never came back. Where have you been all this time?" Lee couldn't believe she thought she could just come back and act as if nothing had happened. "You left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye to me or the boys, and you expect me to just welcome you back with open arms?" Gloria sighed. "I caught a train back east. My grandmother still lives in New York, and she was happy to welcome me home." "I see. Why did you leave?" He tried to keep the hurt out of his voice as he asked the question. He didn't want her back, but he had to know what had happened all those years ago. How could he have left her 2 tiny infant sons? Now, sure, any woman would leave them now, but then? They had done nothing to deserve her behavior. She shrugged. "I didn't like being a mother. I didn't much like being a wife either." I think I was too young for the responsibilities that came with parenthood. She looked down at her hands as if she were embarrassed about what happened. I wandered out into the storm, hoping I'd die. But you didn't. Did you know they found a young blonde woman whose face had been so badly mutilated they assumed it was you after that storm let up? Lee had never encountered such a selfish creature in his life. How on earth had he once that he loved her? She nodded. I did know that. I knew that's why you weren't looking for me. She took a deep breath. I hid in a barn until the next morning, and I told the farmer that found me that my husband hit me. He gave me the money to travel to my grandmother, which I then sent back to him when I got there. She sighed. I know it was dishonest, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Lee shook his head slowly. No, I can't. I can't ever forgive you for abandoning me and my boys. He said a quick prayer for patience. Why did you come back here? Did you really think I'd welcome you with open arms? That was the real question at this point. What did she want from him, and how long before she left them all alone again? Gloria shook her head. No, I met a man back east, you see. He knows all about you and the boys, and he paid for a lawyer to draw up divorce papers. I have them back at the hotel. Lee breathed a sigh of relief. Yes, that's a good idea. I'll sign the papers. And then he could marry Jasmine again. How was he ever going to explain to his spitfire of a wife that he wasn't really married to her? I thought, well, after seeing you, and seeing the boys, I've realized that I still love you. I don't want to marry Alfred. Her eyes were wide as she stared at him beseechingly. I want to stay here with you and the boys. Lee shook his head. There's no way. Just bring me the papers to sign, and you can be on your way. I'm married to someone else now. She's a good woman, and she loves the boys more than I ever thought a stepmother could. He was surprised by just how little desire he had to even talk to her. He did not want this woman back in his life. But she's their stepmother. I'm their real mother. She could never love them like I do. Lee was so angry, he was no longer able to use any diplomacy at all. You don't love them. When you love someone, you stay with them and work out your problems. He shook his head. Jasmine took one look at those boys and knew they needed to be hers. You took one look at them and wanted to get away. She's a real mother to them. He knew he was being harsh, but he didn't regret the words one bit. He just wanted her to go away so he could get on with his life. He'd finally found the woman who had completed him, and he wasn't giving her up for anything. Gloria sighed, obviously annoyed by what he said. I'll make you a deal, Lee. Let me have a week to get to know you and my boys again. If you still want me to go at the end of the week, I'll give you the papers to sign, and I'll go home to Vermont. I deserve a week, though. Lee shook his head. You deserve nothing from me. He turned on his heel and walked away, heading toward his wife and sons at the restaurant. He walked instead of driving, because he knew he needed to cool off before he could face his sweet Jasmine. She was going to skin him alive. When Jasmine arrived at the restaurant, she didn't say a word to her mother or aunt, but instead, walked straight into Daisy's arms and cried. It appears I'm not married after all. She pulled her handkerchief from her bag. The boys and I will need to live with you for a while. She wiped her eyes as she waited for Daisy to agree, not that it mattered if she did or not. She and the boys were moving in with her. Daisy's eyes widened and she stared at her sister and then at the twin boys who were looking at her in confusion. You can't just take Lee's boys from him, you don't have the right. Jasmine's eyes grew fierce. I'd just like to see someone try to stop me. They're mine now. She didn't care if her louse of a husband was married to that little snob, she was going to keep her boys. They'd have to pry them out of her cold dead arms. She walked to the table her family was surrounding and sat down, putting the boys together across the table from her. She refused to talk about what had happened as they ate, and it was halfway through the meal before Lee came into the restaurant and sat in the empty chair beside her, catching her hand in his. Jasmine, you have to understand. He kept his voice to a whisper, and since they were on one end of the table, the others couldn't hear them. She seemed angry, and he hadn't even tried to talk to her yet. He was almost afraid of what this little hellion would do to him. She pulled her hand away from him. "It's Miss Sullivan to you, and I have absolutely nothing to say. How could a married man have married her? What had she done wrong, to make God think she should be punished this way?" She wanted to throw her water in his face, but she didn't want to embarrass her mother that way, so she sat and acted like the lady her mother had tried so hard to raise her to be. "Jasmine, they found a body the next week, I swear. The face was torn up by wild animals. I believed it was her. I didn't know I was still married." He had to get her to believe him. He'd never loved Gloria the way he loved Jasmine, and she had to listen to him. "I even had to go and identify the body." He would never forget the day he'd stood over a woman he thought was his wife and shuddered, wondering what he could have possibly done to make her think death was better than staying with him and their boys. Jasmine turned to him, the anger flashing in her brown eyes. "Really? And she didn't know where you were until today? Didn't you live in the same house when you were married to the little heifer?" Jasmine bit her lip, realizing she'd just called another woman a cow. Her mother would not approve of that language. She needed to either clean up what she was saying, or make sure her mother didn't hear her. "At all." He sighed. "She said she left planning to freeze to death in the storm. She was unhappy, and she had to get away. She came back today with divorce papers for me to sign." He could think of nothing he wanted more than divorce papers, except a real marriage to Jasmine. Jasmine sighed with relief. "Well, that's a good start. Did you sign them?" If he had, they could head over the preacher's house that afternoon, and be married for real this time. She wouldn't complain at all, and would probably even be able to forgive him in a year or two if they could marry right away. She didn't even care if she was wearing an old dress and didn't have Jasmine for her bouquet. As long as they could be married immediately. "She doesn't want a divorce anymore. She said she saw me today and realized she still loved me, so she decided to come home to me. She wants to meet the boys." He closed his eyes waiting for her temper to flare. They both knew she wasn't going to put up with that. Jasmine shook her head. "No, she can't have you, and she can't have my boys. She can go right back to wherever she's been for the past 7 years. Jasmine couldn't lose the boys. She was angry at him, so she could think about ways her life would be better without him, but the boys? They'd done nothing wrong, and she wasn't about to lose them. She'd never loved anyone from the moment she saw them the way she had those boys as she'd watched them slide a snake into old man Seaver's pocket. He kept talking, but she pretended not to hear him. "She wants to get to know her sons, and I think we should let her. The sooner she realizes they aren't the angels they appeared to be this morning, the sooner she'll leave me alone and we can be married for real." He wanted her to agree to his plan. Even though they were no longer married, she felt as if they were still on the same team. "Do you realize you're a bigamist? Being married to 2 women is against the law." Jasmine hissed at him. How could this be happening? For once in her life, she was surrounded by trouble she hadn't brought on herself, and she had no idea of how to get out of it. He leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "Are you listening to anything I'm saying?" She shook her head. "No, I'm not, and I don't plan to. You do whatever you want, but my boys and I are moving in with my sister." She turned back to her food and took a bite, doing her very best to pretend he didn't exist. How dare he come in here and act like she still cared for him when he was married to someone else? What was he thinking? Lee stared at her with his jaw dropped. "They're my boys, not yours." She didn't really think she could leave him and take his boys with her, did she? She'd only known them for a few months. "I think you must be mistaken," she told him. "You see, I married a man with 2 sweet little boys. He turned out to be much less than I expected, but the boys are so much more. I'm keeping them." Her tone of voice told him that the matter wasn't up for discussion. They were hers now, and that was that. Lee looked at the boys who were happily eating their lunch. "You boys are leaving with me as soon as you're finished eating." They both looked at Jasmine, as if they were waiting for her to make the decision for them. "You're mine and you're staying with me." She smiled at them, because they hadn't done anything to cause this problem. It was all her husband and her husband's wife. Yes, Ma, they answered in unison. Their faces were as angelic as always as they smiled at her. We'll be by for our things this evening, Jasmine told him. I hope you'll be kind enough to not get in my way while we're there. She continued to eat as if she didn't care one way or the other what he did. He could come back to her once his wife was gone, and he had divorce papers in his hand. Mary and Harriet were careful not to ask any questions before they reached the buggy. After Eli had helped everyone in, and Jasmine had the boys on her lap, they drove off down the road. As soon as they were out of sight of town, Mary looked at Jasmine. What on earth happened to you? Her voice was filled with disapproval, the same disapproval Jasmine had heard over and over as she'd grown up. She didn't want to be blamed for this. For once, she'd done nothing wrong, and she wasn't going to accept criticism. Jasmine shook her head, nodding to the boys. We'll talk later. She wasn't willing to let her boys know what was going on. They had every right in the world to think their world was wonderful for another few hours. Eli knew something big had happened, so when they arrived at the ranch, he had the boys help him unhitch the horses and groom them. He whispered to Daisy he could buy them about 30 minutes, but not much more. Jasmine followed her mother and aunt into the house, while Daisy brought up the rear with the baby, who was sleeping in her arms. As soon as Dinah was in her cradle, she walked into the kitchen and sat in her rocking chair. Okay, Jasmine. Tell us everything you know. Daisy gave Jasmine an encouraging look, trying to tell her without words that she supported whatever her sister decided to do. Jasmine sat on one of the hard wooden chairs that circled the table and sighed. Everything was going great. Lee and I are doing well. The boys are adjusting to having me around. I had no complaints. She threw her hands up in the air, and then his wife showed up out of nowhere. At the look of confusion on the older women's faces, she added. You know, his dead wife and the mother of the twins? She knew she was shrieking, but she needed to shriek. She needed to go outside and just scream for an hour or two. It would make her feel so much better. Harriet stared at Jasmine in disbelief. If he knew she was still alive, no one else did. He must have truly thought she was dead. Jasmine shrugged. Whether he thought so or not, she isn't. I can't be married to a married man, so I'm back to being Jasmine Sullivan until such time as he signs the divorce papers he claims she brought with her, or I marry someone else. She folded her arms across her chest. Either way, I'm keeping my sons. She wasn't going to listen to any arguments about the boys either. They were hers. Mary sighed. Only you could get into this kind of mess, Jasmine. Jasmine stared at her mother in disbelief. She was being blamed for her husband's wife coming back from the dead? How could that possibly be her fault? I did nothing wrong here, Mama. If you hadn't been in such an all-fired hurry to marry, she'd have come before the wedding vows. Jasmine glared at her mother. So it's my fault his dead wife isn't really dead and showed up on our doorstep? She couldn't believe she was being blamed for this. Yes, she'd done a lot of things she deserved blame for over the years, but this time, she was the innocent one. Would you have preferred I'd had relations with the man before marriage? Because I promise you, if we hadn't married when we did, that would have happened. Mary bit her lip, obviously wanting to say more that she knew she shouldn't say. What about the boys? They're his sons. You don't really think you can keep them, do you? They're mine now too. They may have another mother, but she abandoned them, and they love me, and I love them. A lot more than she possibly could, because the worthless idiot doesn't even know them. Jasmine folded her arms over her chest. Love counts for a lot when parenting is involved. Jasmine. You will not start calling names. Jasmine folded her arms across her chest. At this point, I'll say anything I darned well please, Mama. I'm spitting mad, and everyone should be happy that woman is not within my sight, because right about now, I'd be ripping her pretty blonde hair right out of her head. She needed support right then, and her family was right there. Why weren't they giving it to her? You weren't raised to speak that way, Jasmine. Right now, I just don't care, Mama. My husband is married to someone else. I think I have a right to be mad and throw a temper tantrum if I want to. Jasmine stood up and stalked outside and toward the huge field where Lee kept the cattle. She needed a little time to calm down before she sat down and explained to the boys what had happened. What could she possibly say? Jasmine took a long walk and did some serious thinking. It was 2 hours before she returned to the house, and the boys were sitting at the table eating the cake her sister had made for them. She cut herself a piece of the cake and sat down across from them. We need to have a talk. Jacob looked at her, his eyes sad. What's wrong? Why are you sad, Ma? Jasmine had thought and thought about the best way to talk to the boys about the situation, and she'd decided that they deserved the truth as she knew it. Well, did you boys see that woman that your papa was talking to after church today? She had blonde hair that was up in a bun? That I'm going to rip right out of her head if she doesn't stay away from my family. Yes, ma'am. Joey answered. Who was she? She was your mother. She didn't die in that snowstorm like we thought she did. She went to live back east. She took each of the boys' hands in hers, doing her best to comfort them. She knew what she was telling them was a huge shock. They'd spent their entire life believing their mother had died. Now she was telling them she had just left? Jacob looked at her in surprise. She didn't like us? A tear formed at the corner of his eye. That's not it, sweetheart. She didn't know you. She didn't take the time to get to know either of you. You were just babies when she left. Jasmine shook her head, trying to do the right thing as she talked to them. She wants to get to know you both better while she's here. She hated the idea of her sons getting to know their real mother. She wasn't jealous though. It was anger for the way the woman had treated them in the past. Joey made a face. But Dot, if she's our ma, then she's married to Papa. What about you? I still love you the same way I did yesterday and the day before. You two boys mean everything to me. I want you to stay with me, here at my sister's house until all this is resolved. She didn't add that they didn't really have a choice. She wasn't giving them up for anything. Jacob nodded emphatically, and she realized they still needed a haircut. We want to stay with you, Ma. She can't be our ma if she doesn't really know us. Jasmine sighed. Joey? I'm staying with you and my brother and my grandma. Good. She stood up. Now that's settled, I think it's time you boys got a haircut. She went and brought back Daisy's sewing scissors, and put a towel around Jacob's neck. You're next, so don't move a muscle. She pointed at Joey with the scissors. The boys sat patiently while she trimmed their hair. Once she was done, she cleaned up the mess again before sitting down with them. We need to go to the house now and get enough clothes to last us a while. We can wash here. Both boys nodded. Do you want to go with me? Or do you want to stay here with Grandma, and Aunt Harriet, and Aunt Daisy? She didn't know if she wanted the boys to stay or go with her. Joey looked at her. We want to at least tell Papa that he needs to find a way to make the other ma leave so we can all live together again. Jasmine thought about that for a moment before nodding. That sounds like a good idea. She stood and walked to the front door. She knew everyone in the family was outside to avoid listening to her talk with the boys. Eli? Would you take us to Lee's ranch, please? We need to pick up some clothes. She was dealing with everyone much better after her walk. She'd been willing to hurt someone before. Eli nodded, letting her know that he'd been filled in on the events that had taken place immediately after church. While he hitched the wagon, the boys hugged Mary. You're still our grandma, right? Jacob asked. Mary hugged them both close. I'll always be your grandma. Don't you forget that. Harriet patted Jasmine's shoulder. Do you want me to go with you? Jasmine shook her head. This is something I need to do. I probably shouldn't even ask Eli to drive us. She shrugged. You know, he's hitching up the buggy. I can drive the boys over. She walked to the stable where he was leading the horse out. You don't need to drive us. If you'll just hitch up the buggy, the boys and I will go over on our own. She didn't want to inconvenience him any more than she had to. Eli hesitated. Are you certain? I don't mind driving you. It's your one day you take off every week to be with your family. You spent last Sunday riding all over the state having people answer questions about the man I wanted to marry. Then this week, it's all about me again. She put her hand on his arm. You've been a better brother than I deserve. The boys and I will be fine. Eli finally nodded. I'll let you go then. Jasmine smiled. Thank you. She and the boys watched as he hitched the horse to the buggy, before climbing in. We won't take too long. Chapter 7. Jasmine and the boys talked as they drove to the ranch, each of the boys worried about what it would be like to meet their birth mother. What if she doesn't like us? Joey asked. No ladies like us except you. Jasmine shook her head. Don't worry about that. It's not true anyway. My mother and my aunt both love you. She didn't add that her sister Daisy was half afraid of them, because they didn't need to know that. Jacob looked down, obviously worried as well. They only love us 'cause you do. That's not true at all. They love you for who you are. Her heart ached for the boys. I don't think she's staying at the ranch, so we probably won't see her right now. We'll ask your papa when he wants you to meet her. She'd better not be staying at the ranch. Her husband, and she couldn't stop thinking of him that way, had better not be having relations with another woman. You won't leave her with us? Joey asked. I will not. I will stay by your side the entire time if that's what you want me to do. The boys were afraid to be alone with their own mother. That said a lot to Jasmine. What would have made a woman want to leave a wonderful husband like Lee and two sweet boys? Was she crazy? Jacob nodded. That's what we want. If she's mean, we might need you to protect us. Jasmine thought about the woman she'd seen. She hadn't looked like she would or could hurt anyone, but she hadn't thought anyone could abandon 3-month-old twins just because she wasn't ready to be a mother. She wasn't going to believe their mother incapable of anything. When she pulled up in front of the house, she stared up at it sadly. It held good memories for her, and she didn't want to go in there and collect her things. She was still mad at Lee, but she wasn't willing to give up what they had together. She carefully got down from the buggy and walked to the front door, not bothering to knock. Lee? We came to get some of our things. Lee walked out of their bedroom, looking sadder than she'd ever seen him. She wanted to go to him and comfort him, but she was afraid of what it might lead to. They weren't really married. Can we talk now? He asked. He wasn't sure how she'd react to him after the way she'd exploded at him earlier. She didn't deserve the situation she found herself in, but he didn't either. Jasmine nodded. Yes, I think I'm ready. She knew they needed to talk, if only for the boys' sake. She wanted to talk to him for her sake as well, though. She wanted to spend as much time with him as possible. How could she not? She loved him even if he was married to another woman. They walked into the parlor together, and she sat beside him on the sofa, careful not to let their bodies touch. For now, he was married to another woman. When I talked to Gloria this afternoon, she said that if I let her spend some time with the boys this week, and with me, if I didn't want her to stay after 1 week, she'd give me the divorce papers and leave. That's what I want to do. He took her hand in his. I need you to understand that I want the divorce papers. I want to marry you just as soon as I possibly can. He sighed. You're my wife, Jasmine. Not her. She's been dead to me for years. Jasmine hated the idea. I promised the boys I wouldn't leave them alone with her. She thought for a moment. She wants to spend time with you and the boys. Did she say I couldn't be there spending time with all of you as well? A plan was forming in her mind to get rid of the other woman once and for all. She would take control of the situation and keep her family together. It was the only answer. Lee grinned, leaning back on the sofa. I knew you'd come up with a solution. You always do. So I guess I wasn't mentioned during that conversation. Good. She considered how they could make it work out. Invite her to dinner here tomorrow night. I'll cook, and she can spend a little time getting to know the boys. And Jasmine had a plan. It may not be a good plan, but they could make it work. Both of them jumped at the knock on the door. Jasmine remained in the parlor while Lee went to go see who it was. Gloria? What are you doing here? I knew you couldn't mean what you said to me earlier, Lee. That red-headed whore couldn't have made you fall in love with her. The blonde sighed dramatically. So I came to see you myself. Jasmine stood and walked to the dining room where the two were standing. That red-headed whore is right here. She smiled sweetly, thinking about how very much she would like to not only snatch the woman bald, but very possibly remove her toenails one by one. It's nice of you to finally come to meet your sons. They're wonderful boys. She called up the stairs. Joey? Jacob? Come down here, please. The boys rushed down the stairs when she called, stopping short when they saw their mother. She held her hand out and the both walked over to her, standing on either side of her. This is Joey, she said, indicating the red-headed boy, and this is Jacob. Gloria looked at the boys and stepped forward with her arms spread. Oh, my babies. How I've missed you both. Neither boy moved from Jasmine's side. How can you miss someone you never bothered to get to know? Joey asked. He was always the more outspoken and stubborn of the two, and just then, Jasmine wanted to cheer him on. Gloria stopped walking toward them, stunned. You can't speak to me that way. I'm your mother. Jacob shook his head. No. A mother is someone who always loves you and stays with you day after day, even if things are hard. You're not a mother, Jasmine's heart sang with the boys' words. You need to be polite, boys. No matter what she'd done, they needed to be polite for now if her plan was going to work. Joey sighed. It's nice to meet you. He held his hand out for Gloria to shake. Lee stood watching the entire exchange, looking as if he wanted to step in, but had no idea how. He was glad the boys didn't want to hug her. He wanted to shout with joy that they realized she'd rejected them completely and that no mother should ever treat her child that way. Gloria shook Joey's hand and then Jacob's. She stared at the boys as if she expected them to do something, but they both just stood close beside Jasmine. Why don't I fix supper for all of us? Jasmine offered. I haven't started anything, but I could make some pancakes with bacon? Or some eggs with bacon? Both meals would be fast and simple. Make pancakes and bacon, Ma. Joey said excitedly. We love pancakes. We'll help you, Ma. Jacob said, each of them taking one of Jasmine's arms and dragging her toward the kitchen. Jasmine gave each of the boys simple tasks to do to keep them busy, while she whipped up the batter for the pancakes and fried the bacon. I have an idea, she said, her voice low. The boys moved closer to her, and she explained what she had plans. Both boys nodded excitedly. As they sat down to eat, Lee said the prayer, and watched as Jasmine played the perfect hostess. He knew she couldn't stand Gloria, so he couldn't help but wonder what she was up to. The boys each grabbed pancakes and used their fingers to dig into the butter crock in front of them. He frowned with surprise. They'd never had manners that were that bad. Gloria watched in horror. Boys? You need to use knives to get the butter out. Jacob looked at her with a sweet smile. But we're not allowed to have knives anymore. Not after what happened last time. Joey nodded. The blood was too much, and Ma said we had to use our fingers from now on. She said getting the dirt from our grimy hands in the butter was so much better than having to try and stitch someone else up. Lee sat blinking at the boys' words. What on earth were they talking about? He decided not to ask. With those two, you never knew what was going to be said. They were turning back into the boys they'd been before Jasmine had come along. Gloria looked at Jasmine. What did they do? Jasmine shook her head, smiling with affection at the boys. I promised them we'd never speak of the incident again. They've apologized to the boy's mother, and both of them talked to the preacher about it. I think God has forgiven them. She nodded regally as if she was in touch with God himself on decisions of forgiveness. Gloria looked back and forth between the boys and Jasmine, obviously wondering what they were hiding. It was all Lee could do not to laugh out loud. Jasmine said he had a plan, and he was just beginning to understand it. "Will you be staying with us while you're here?" Jasmine asked. "Staying here? But, you're going to keep living here even though you know Lee isn't legally married to you?" Jasmine shrugged. "I'll stay in one of the upstairs rooms. I could possibly tear the boys away from their father, and if I'm not here during the day, well, let's just say that wouldn't be an ideal situation. The boys need to be supervised constantly." Gloria was quiet for a moment. "You know? I don't think you two should be here without a chaperone." "Yes, I'll stay here." She smiled sweetly. "I'll take one of the spare rooms upstairs as well. Until I'm certain I'm staying, I don't think I should sleep in the same bed as you." Lee sighed. First everyone left him, and now they were all back, including his dead wife? Was he ready for the invasion? He took a deep breath. He could handle anything they dished out, couldn't he? Lee followed Jasmine and the boys back to the King Ranch and waited while she let everyone know she was going to stay at his place in a spare room. Mary simply shook her head. "I'm washing my hands of this situation, Jasmine. You come home if it doesn't work out. Lee's a good man. I'm sure he'll do what's right." As Lee listened to her, he realized that he really was still a good man. It wasn't his fault all this had happened. Well, he should have been more choosy about his first wife, but other than that, he'd done nothing wrong. He'd felt guilty all day for marrying Jasmine when he was already married, but the circumstances really had been out of his control. As he drove them back to the ranch, Jasmine sat with her head on his shoulder. "I'm sorry I got so angry with you. I hate the situation we're in, but you've really done nothing wrong." She didn't want to admit it to him, but she had to. She loved him, and she needed their marriage to work. As soon as she got rid of his other wife, that was. Lee kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for admitting that." He'd never thought that he would hear Jasmine admit fault for much. He didn't blame her for getting as angry as she had, because he would have gotten angry as well. "My mother is blaming me the situation." Jasmine shook her head sadly. "I've messed up so many times in my life that the one time something isn't my fault, she assumes it is." She couldn't believe her mother was blaming her for Gloria's mess-ups. Of course, everyone had always blamed Jasmine for everything, because most of the time she was at fault. They made it back to the ranch before Gloria did, and she was glad. She hurriedly carried her things up the stairs and chose the bedroom she wanted. She chose the one right beside the boys because they had some real work to do. Gloria wasn't going to know what hit her. She went down the stairs as soon as the boys were tucked in and asked the question that she needed an answer to before she could fully finish her plans. "Is Gloria a light sleeper?" The answer would determine what pranks they could play on her. "Not at all. She would sleep through the boys crying in the middle of the night. I would have to get up and take them to her most of the time." Lee studied Jasmine, obviously worried. "What are you planning?" "I don't think you should do anything crazy." He could just imagine what Jasmine and the boys could do if they joined forces. Just thinking about it scared him a great deal. Jasmine smiled sweetly, patting Lee's cheek. "Don't worry. No one will blame you." She hurried back up the stairs, hoping to get a good night's sleep. She'd need it if she was going to do everything she'd planned the next day. With a little bit of luck, Gloria would be on her way again by Tuesday morning. Chapter 8. Jasmine was up early the next morning, acting as if everything was normal. She cooked bacon, eggs and toast for breakfast, putting the breakfast on the table at sunup as she usually did. The boys made as much noise as they could upstairs, whooping like Indians to make certain Gloria woke. She came down the stairs looking angry and plopped down in the chair at the foot of the table, looking at Jasmine with a gloating smile as if she'd stolen her prize spot. Jasmine guessed she'd never cared about sitting close to Lee when they were married and living together. The boys made certain their table manners were as bad as Gloria had ever seen. Joey leaned over and used Jacob's shirt to wipe the egg yolk from his face. Both boys ate with their mouths open, and talked non-stop about ham while they ate. "Would you like to help us wash our pet?" Jacob asked Gloria, his eyes full of innocence. Gloria smiled, giving Jasmine a triumphant look. I'd like that a lot. Jasmine cleaned the kitchen while the boys had Gloria outside. She listened carefully until she heard the scream she'd been waiting for. Gloria marched into the house covered from head to toe with mud. Why didn't you tell me the boy's pet was a pig? Jasmine shrugged. You didn't ask. I thought you knew when they said his name. She kept washing the dishes, refusing to look in the other woman's face. She was worried her face would give away everything. I never heard his name. They talked about him all through breakfast. Didn't you hear them talking about how much they love him? Gloria closed her eyes, the mud dripping from her hair. They named their pet pig Ham? They certainly did. Jasmine put the last of the dishes away. Why don't you take a quick bath? I'm sure you don't want to be covered in mud for the rest of the day. She smiled sweetly as the other woman left the room, happy their day was going as planned. Both boys were covered in mud as well. Go out to the well and dump buckets of water on each other until you're clean, Jasmine insisted. But, Ma. We thought if you let us stay like this all day, it might bother her. Joey was the one to protest. They'd obviously put a great deal of thought into what they'd do to her. Finally Jasmine nodded. Just make sure you don't track mud on my clean floors. She was glad they were thinking of what to do to help with the plan. They wanted to get rid of her so things could return to normal just as much as she did. We won't. Jacob yelled as the two boys ran off. It was obvious they weren't going to give her any time to change her mind. When Gloria finished with her bath, she found Jasmine in the parlor sewing. What are you making? She asked. Jasmine held up the pile of socks she was working on. I can't ever get around to sewing, because I never have time to do anything but mend. The boys are really hard on their clothes. It was a lie, of course. There was a lot to be done, but she was working through it quickly and efficiently with the help of Mrs. Banks. Gloria wrinkled her nose. Just make them new ones. Why mend the old ones? Because it's faster and less expensive to mend the old ones. Surely you remember what it's like to have to pinch every penny. Jasmine kept darning the socks and watched as the other woman pushed the socks out of the way so she could sit on the couch as well. She didn't pick up a needle to help with the work, which didn't surprise Jasmine one bit. She had a feeling Gloria would not be willing to stay if she thought Lee was anything less than wealthy. How did you meet my Lee? Gloria asked, watching the other woman. Jasmine smiled. Well, I saw him at church one day. He had the boys each by an ear, and he was dragging them out of the church. She sighed. I think that was the day they put a snake in the preacher's Bible. How could any woman not fall in love with a couple of boys who could prank someone so easily? Gloria shook her head. They're beasts, aren't they? Joey and Jacob? They're sweet as can be. I wouldn't trade those boys for anything. Jasmine couldn't believe anyone thought of them as beasts, but she'd seen all the women in the congregation had felt that way about the boys. They were really good boys, but they needed a firm hand. You really seem to believe that. I really do believe that. I couldn't love those boys any more if I'd given birth to them myself. Of course, I'm much too young to have boys that age. You must be at least 30. Jasmine finished the sock she was working on and dropped it into the mended pile. Why don't you fix lunch for us while I work on these? She wasn't about to let the other woman get away with being treated like a guest. She kept saying she was staying, and it was time for her to pull her own weight around the house. Lunch? You do cook, don't you? Jasmine eyed the other woman. She looked pretty useless, but hopefully she could do something. A little. My grandmother has a cook. Oh, yes, so does my mother. I miss being spoiled like that. Jasmine stretched. Since you're going to stay with Lee and the boys, I guess I'll need to head back to Seattle and my easy life there. She looked down at her hands, trying to give the impression that thinking about leaving the area was her only answer. Of course, she would never give in to the other woman, but she couldn't let her know that yet. You're not going to stay? There's nothing for me here. My husband isn't really my husband, and I can see the boys like you better than me. I'd better just move on back to my family. Jasmine sighed. I sure will miss the boys, though. She shook her head and forced a tear from her eye. She'd learned to cry on command years before. Gloria looked at her. You don't have to let me cook today. You can do it if you want to. No, I think you should get used to cooking for your family again. I wouldn't deprive you of the pleasure. Jasmine smiled. In fact, since you're here to see to things, I think I'll nap until lunch. There's really no need for me to work on darning the socks when I'm leaving soon anyway. As she reached the doorway, she called back over her shoulder. Don't forget to keep an eye on the boys. We don't need to lose any more animals. Jasmine bit her lip to stifle her laugh at the other woman's gasp. Any more animals? What do they do to animals? Gloria sounded frightened. Jasmine stifled a giggle as she walked from the room. She went upstairs where she lay in bed with a pencil and a piece of paper with a book to use as a writing surface. She carefully made notes of what they needed to do during the night to make sure the plan was accomplished. She and the boys had a long night ahead of them. A few hours later, Jasmine crept upstairs while Gloria did the supper dishes. She wouldn't have left any other woman in the world to do the dishes alone, but Gloria needed to learn what it was like to have a husband and 2 7-year-old children to deal with and take care of on her own. Of course, the opportunity to short-sheet Gloria's bed was too good to pass up. The boys were right behind her as she went into the other woman's room. We have to work fast, boys. They quickly short-sheeted the bed and remade it with Jasmine explaining the right way to do it. While the boys gathered up some of her clothes so they could help them, Jasmine stuck a snake in Gloria's bed. It was just a little garter snake, so she refused to feel guilty about it. The snake wouldn't hurt Gloria, but it might just scare her a bit and make her realize that messing with people's lives deserved punishment. She went into the parlor with her family to listen to Lee read from Alice in Wonderland again. The boys once again played with blocks, while Jasmine sat beside Lee on the sofa. That's how Gloria found them when she finished with the dishes. She took the seat perpendicular to the sofa and listened while Lee read. Normally Jasmine would have some mending in her hands, but that evening she refused, even though she knew she'd regret it later. She had to make it look like she was leaving. When Lee told the boys to brush their teeth and get ready for bed, they both started screaming and kicking their feet. Lee stared at them in astonishment, and then caught the look on Jasmine's face. He shook his head. What else had she put the boys up to? They would never act like that at bedtime without a reason. They were basically well-behaved boys, except when they were playing practical jokes and running amok. Gloria stood up and yelled, "Get to bed, you rotten boys." She drew her foot back to kick Jacob in the ribs, but Jasmine was across the room in a flash with the blonde's hair in her hand. You will not kick my sons. Jasmine's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the anger in her voice. She knew she wasn't playing her part by stepping in, but she would not let anyone hurt the boys. Joey stared up at his mother. I hate you. You were going to kick my brother. You're a mean old witch, and I hope you go back to wherever you came from. Jasmine didn't chastise him even though she knew he was no longer play-acting. She agreed with every word he said, and she wasn't going to get on to him for saying them. Of course, she'd have a talk with him later about how he couldn't be rude to most adults. Jacob stood up and looked at his mother, his breathing harsh and labored. You really would have kicked me, wouldn't you? He spit at her feet, careful to hit her shoes and not the floor. He didn't want to upset his new ma. Gloria wiped her face with disgust. Look at what you've done to these boys, Lee Fields. You've ruined them both. She turned and ran up the stairs to her room and slammed the door. Jasmine opened her arms wide and both boys ran into them. She won't stay long. I promise you that. She kissed each boy atop his head. We'll make sure of it. Her eyes met Lee's over the boys, and he just shook his head. His face was white. Joey looked up at her and kissed her cheek. You're our ma now. She needs to go away. Jasmine nodded. Yes, she does. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger that was still coursing through her body. You two go on and get ready for bed, we'll be up to tuck you in. She pushed them toward the door. She had to talk to Lee before she lost the opportunity. As soon as they were gone, Jasmine looked at Lee. Was she always like that? She'd never seen that type of angry display from a woman to her own child. What kind of mother would kick her son in the ribs? Lee sighed and nodded. I didn't see it until after married her. She was nothing like you. Well, you see the positive side of things, and we enjoy being around you. She hated everyone and everything. One night, when we were first married, I kissed her, and she started screaming at me that all I ever wanted to do was go to bed with her. He rubbed the back of his neck. She was right, but we were newly married. How was I supposed to feel? He realized that Jasmine would understand because she had the same desires he did. Jasmine looked at him with new understanding. You're not worried I'm going to feel that way someday, are you? She knew she'd never lose her desire for her husband. Everything about him made her feel more every time she looked at him. He laughed. There are no worries there at all. At first there were, but now. We need to find a friend to watch the boys from Saturday evening until Monday morning soon and have some time alone together. He leaned down and kissed her cheek, not willing to kiss her the way he wanted to when he was married to another woman. She grinned. As soon as we're legally married. She bit her lip. Did she ever try to hurt the boys? She needed to know, because she had to know if they needed to be protected from their mother. Obviously they did with the kick, but did the woman need to be watched every minute as Jasmine had claimed the boys did? They were only 3 months old when she left, but yes, she did. She got mad at Jacob for crying too much one evening, and she shook him really hard, screaming in his face to stop crying. He sighed. It really scared me. That's when I hired Mrs. Banks to be here most of the time I couldn't be. Mrs. Banks thinks the boys are hellions, but she's loyal to them and would never hurt them. He weighed his next words carefully. As sad as I was when I thought she died, I was also relieved. He'd been relieved for himself and the boys. He hadn't started wife shopping immediately, not with 2 babies, and by the time he had, his boys were already well known in the area as hellions. Jasmine shook her head. All of her reservations about what she and the boys were planning to do to Gloria disappeared. She was doing the best thing for all of them. Even herself. Jasmine woke to Gloria's screams the following morning, and she sat up in bed and smiled. Gloria must have gotten the surprise she and the boys had worked so hard on. The snake in her bed the previous night had the woman screaming and begging for Lee to let her sleep in his bed. When he'd flat out refused, Jasmine knew she'd won. Jasmine got up and walked down the hall to where the boys were already standing outside Gloria's room looking at her. Ham was tucked nicely in bed with her, under the covers and everything, but he was taking up a lot of space. Gloria was sputtering. Did you really put a pig in bed with me while I was sleeping? What is wrong with you 2 monsters? Jacob shrugged. We never had a ma, you see, to teach us right from wrong. By the time our new ma came into our lives, we were already used to our bad ways. She tried to help us, but she just couldn't do it, Joey added. Jasmine put a hand on each boy's shoulder. You need to get him out of your mother's room, boys. She carefully kept her face blank, doing her best not to laugh at the boys' answers. She'd coached them a little on the right things to say, but for the most part, it was all them. Joey nodded. Yes, ma'am. He rushed into the room and caught the pig by the rope they kept tied around his neck as a leash, pulling him from the room. Jasmine smiled at the other woman. Are you all right? She asked. Why don't I make breakfast? You shouldn't have to cook when you've received such a scare this morning. She was careful to make sure her voice was filled with sympathy for the other woman's plight. Of course, she would never have bent under the pressure of pranks. She'd have been plotting revenge instead of crying the way Gloria was. That would be nice. Gloria fell back into her bed with a sob. I'll leave you to get dressed then. Jasmine closed the door, hiding her smile until she was halfway down the stairs. She could see the other woman was about to break, and it was about time. She'd only set 4 places for breakfast, she decided. There was no way Gloria would stick around for long enough to eat with them. She made bacon and French toast for breakfast, listening for more screams from upstairs. She knew they were coming. She had just dipped the first piece of bread into the egg and milk mixture when she heard a shout of anger. Within minutes, Gloria was stomping down the stairs. Jasmine walked into the dining room to put the platter of bacon on the table and saw the other woman slam open Lee's door. "Lee Fields, you can just come out here right now. Do you have any idea what those little hellions did?" Lee's eyes met Jasmine's over Gloria's head. "I don't. I hope they didn't hurt you." He was honest when he said that. He didn't want Gloria to be hurt, he just wanted her to give him the divorce papers and leave his life forever. Was that too much to ask? Gloria shook her head. "No, they didn't hurt me." She took a deep breath. While she was getting ready to yell at Lee, Jasmine saw her bag, full of clothes on the floor at her feet, and she grinned. They'd won. She and the boys had scared off Gloria. "I'm glad they didn't hurt you, Gloria," Lee said, doing his best to keep his eyes off his wife who was clutching her mouth to hold her laughter in. What on earth had the three of them done? "They sewed the top of my bloomers together. I went to put my legs into them, and they wouldn't go in. I had to look at them to see why." Gloria shook her head, obviously extremely annoyed. "And then I went to put my favorite boots on. Do you see the shoes I'm wearing?" She poked her foot out from under her dress for Lee to see. "They're meant for parties, not for walking around in Montana. Do you know why I'm wearing these shoes, Lee?" Lee shook his head. "No, but I'm sure you're going to tell me." "Because they filled my boots with honey." "Honey? Nothing is stickier than honey." Gloria had descended to full-scale screaming, and Jasmine had to sit down, because she was laughing so hard she couldn't stop. Jacob walked in then. "That's not exactly true. Glue is stickier than honey." His voice was matter-of-fact as he gave his mother that information. Gloria's hands reached out and she went for Jacob's throat. "I'm going to kill you." Jasmine and Lee both jumped forward, the humor immediately leaving the situation. Jasmine put herself between Jacob and Gloria while Lee grabbed Gloria's arm. "You will never hurt one of my sons. Do you understand me?" Lee was shaking with anger. How could this witch call herself a mother? What was wrong with her? Gloria reached into the top of her bag and pulled out a sheaf of papers that she threw into Lee's face. "Sign them and our divorce is legal. Don't bother trying to find me. I'm going to marry a rich banker and never dream of having children again." "The world thanks you," Jasmine mumbled beneath her breath. Joey heard the words and rushed for the door. "Let me get the door for you." "Papa? Do you want me to hitch up the wagon?" Lee laughed. Joey had never hitched up the wagon in his life and would have no idea how to go about doing it. "I'm going to wait until after breakfast to take her back to town, Joey." "Gloria? Will you eat with us?" His offer was just to be polite, and everyone there knew it. He wanted her out of his house as soon as she would get out. Gloria turned on her heel. "Absolutely not. I'll never eat with you again. I'll start walking to Billings. Please come and take me the rest of the way after breakfast." She picked up her bag and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Lee looked over at Jasmine and noted she'd only set 4 places at the table. "That confident in what you did?" His eyes were full of laughter as he looked at his whole family. She was gone, and they'd be a real family again. Jasmine's eyes were dancing when she looked at him. "I'm definitely that confident in what I did." She poured them each a glass of milk as the boys took their spots at the table. Lee walked to where Jasmine was standing with the pitcher of milk and dropped to his knees. "I didn't ask you properly the first time, so I'm going to do it right this time." "Jasmine? My love?" Jasmine looked down at Lee and felt tears sparking her eyes. "Yes, Lee?" He was going to propose, even though she'd already married him. "Will you marry me and spend the rest of your life having babies with me and making me the happiest man alive?" She laughed. "Of course, I will." "Get up, silly man." Once he'd gotten to his feet, she threw her arms around him and hugged him tightly. How could she not agree to marry him? They were going to have to fight over the boys if she didn't. I think we're going to have another wedding today, boys, Lee announced. He looked over at the boys to see how they'd react to the news. Jacob shrugged. Okay. Are we going to be having them every week? Jasmine laughed. I sure hope not. Weekly weddings would get tedious, wouldn't they? She looked at Lee. Would you mind driving by Eli's place so I can invite my sister to my real wedding? Mama and Aunt Harriet left to go back to Seattle yesterday, but at least my sister can be with me. She wished her mother hadn't left before everything was all tied together, but she would write her a letter telling her what had happened. They were halfway to Daisy's house when she spotted what she was looking for off to the side of the road. Lee, wait. Lee stopped the wagon, and she quickly jumped down without help, picking a fistful of the jasmine that grew wild on the side of the road. She'd have Daisy put some in her hair, and she'd carry the rest as a bouquet. Another half-mile down the road they spotted Gloria, walking toward town. We need to offer her a ride, Lee. Jasmine hated saying it, but she couldn't let her boy's mother walk all the way to town without even offering. Jasmine hoped she'd say no, but they would offer. Lee groaned but pulled over. Need a ride to town? He asked. Please say no. Gloria looked from the twins to Jasmine and shook her head. Not from you. It was so nice meeting you, Gloria. Now I know where the boys get all their good qualities from. Jasmine smiled at the older woman as she said the words, waiting for her to take the bait. Gloria smiled sweetly. Thank you. They're so like Lee, aren't they? Jasmine's smile was filled with pure joy as Lee drove off, leaving Gloria on the side of the road. When they arrived at Daisy's house, Daisy pulled Jasmine into a tight hug when she heard the news. I'm so glad it's working out. Of course, we'll be there for the wedding. She didn't add the word again, but it was unspoken in the air between them. Thank you for standing by me through this, Jasmine told her sister. I couldn't have stayed strong without you. Knowing I had a place to go where Mother wouldn't be constantly blaming me was really important. Jasmine was still hurt that her other had told her that she was at fault for the situation. How could she have possibly known that Gloria was still alive? No one had known. Daisy smiled. That reminds me. Mother left you a letter. She walked to the mantel and pulled down a folded piece of paper, bringing it back to Jasmine. Jasmine's face fell. I'm sure it's just telling me that I did everything wrong by rushing to marry, and if I'd waited a year like she wanted me to, everything would have been resolved long before the wedding day. She didn't want to read the letter. She was sick of being blamed for anything bad that happened to anyone in the Sullivan family. Sure, in the past it had been mostly her fault, but it wasn't any longer. She'd turned over a new leaf. She accepted the letter from her sister and sat down at the table to read it while Lee was out finding Eli on the ranch. They wanted him there when they married as well. Dear Jasmine, I'm so sorry I reacted the way I did when you told me about your troubles. I need to remember that you've grown up a great deal. Sometimes I see you as that little 10-year-old who was sneaking reptiles into her sister's beds just to hear how loudly they would scream. You've turned into a good daughter, a good sister, and more importantly, a good wife and mother. I'm very proud of you. I'm proud that despite your propensity for causing destruction, you can be a good mother. Those boys would never be as happy with anyone else in the world for a mother. You, my dear Jasmine, are exactly what they need. You are the wife your husband needs. I know he's probably not your husband as you read these words, but I trust the two of you will resolve that quickly. I love you, Jasmine, and I never should have been so critical when you told me about your problem that was bothering you a great deal. Just as you are constantly growing as a woman, so I am. I will endeavor to be a better mother to the woman you have become, and not just to the girl you were. Please forgive me. I wait to hear of the joyous news of your marriage to the father of my newest grandsons. Give them my love. You know you have it. All my love, Mama. Jasmine felt the tears streaming down her cheeks as she read the letter once more. She'd needed the letter. It made her feel as if her mother could finally see all the changes she'd worked so hard to make. She'd resisted the almost overwhelming urge to play her jokes for almost a year, and yes, she'd gone a bit overboard with them lately, but the boys had needed what she'd done to them, and Gloria had needed to get out of Montana. She sighed and looked at Daisy. "Did you read it? Did the rest of the family feel the same? Or did they still think of her as prank-playing Jasmine?" Daisy shook her head. "No, but Mama told me she was apologizing for blaming you for the fiasco with Gloria." She sat down and took Jasmine's hand in hers. "I know it seems like you're the outsider in our family, what with the names we've all called you, and the way we react to your jokes, but you're not. You're so very loved, Jasmine. I hope you know that." Jasmine dashed away a tear. "I do now, thank you." She smiled at her sister, knowing she'd just been given the greatest wedding gift she could have ever received. Love and acceptance for who she was from her family. Joey walked into the house then, slightly dirtier than the last time Jasmine had seen him. He took one look at Jasmine and walked to Daisy as if he wanted to hurt her, his entire 7-year-old stature looming over his sitting aunt. "Did you make my ma cry?" His hands were balled into fists at his sides. Daisy smiled and shook her head. "No, I didn't. Your grandma made your ma cry, but they're happy tears." He seemed to accept that for an answer as he looked around for a moment. "Where's my grandma anyway?" He obviously wanted to see her again. "She had to go home to our sisters in Seattle." "You need to talk your ma into taking you on the train to see her. You'd love Seattle." Daisy smiled at her new nephew. She obviously loved them, despite what she'd thought of them in the past, and Jasmine as thankful for Hat. Joey seemed to consider it for a moment. "Not until after the wedding, though. We need to be sure we can keep her before we let her go back there." He turned and left the house in search of his brother. Jasmine grinned. "I think the boys like me." Both of them had done everything they could to show her that fact in the last week. How could a woman have ever found 2 more perfect boys to be her sons? Daisy laughed softly. "I don't think those boys could love you any more if you'd given birth to them." She smiled. "I'm glad you're going to be getting married again today, though. Think of the wedding night you can have when you have an idea of what goes on in the bedroom." Jasmine grinned. "I hadn't thought of that. I'll make sure it's the best second wedding night a couple has ever had." She thought about Lee, and couldn't help but be filled with an overwhelming sense of love. She loved him and his boys. Did life get better than that? Chapter 9. The pastor was more than a little surprised to see Jasmine, Lee, and the boys along with Daisy, Eli, and Dinah. "What are you all doing back here?" he asked, looking between them. Lee took a step forward. "Well, Pastor, it turns out the boy's mother has been alive all this time. She came into town to get me to sign divorce papers." He pulled the papers out and showed the pastor, who frowned. "We thought it was a legal wedding, or we'd never have come to you." He left out all the drama that had occurred that week. As the pastor read the papers, he kept looking at the boys to be certain they weren't causing mischief. After the snake had ended up in his Bible that day at church, he'd never really trusted them again. Jasmine clutched her flowers in her fist, hoping the pastor would understand their dilemma. The pastor frowned down at the papers in his hand and shook his head. "Well, I'll be." He opened his door wide. "Come on in, and we'll get you 2 married again." He looked at Lee with a frown. "I hope you're not planning to make this a weekly thing." Jasmine let out a giggle and looked down as the pastor frowned at her. How could she not laugh at that? It was almost the same thing the boys had said. "Of course not, sir. We just didn't know I was still married." The words sounded like they were ridiculous to Lee's ears even as he said them. He didn't know he was married? What kind of idiot doesn't know when he's married? The pastor just shook his head as he led them into his house, and they all stood around. This time when Jasmine repeated her vows, she knew that she truly meant them. She had a much better idea what marriage with Lee would be like, and she was thrilled to be taking his name. When she said, "I do," the boys said the words with her. They also said the words with Lee. The pastor just shook his head and got them married as quickly as he could. Lee kissed Jasmine with the days of passion he'd held inside while she wouldn't let him kiss her. He grinned as he realized he'd get a second wedding night with his Jasmine that night. How many men got 2 wedding nights with the one woman they loved? They had lunch at the restaurant there in town, and Jasmine insisted on stopping at the Mercantile afterward. She bought the boys each a new toy to thank them for their help in getting Gloria out of their lives forever. While she was there, she got the supplies she was low on and then went out to get in the wagon and go home. She was so happy to be married again, she just couldn't express it. They made the drive slow and leisurely because none of them were in any hurry. It was a special day for all of them. They'd gotten Gloria to leave, and they had gotten married for real this time. On their way, they saw Gloria still walking toward town. She couldn't have eaten all day. "I think we should ask her if she wants a ride again," Jasmine said. Lee looked at her, more than a little annoyed at the suggestion, but stopped and called down to his ex-wife. "Gloria? You sure you don't want that ride to town?" He didn't want her in the wagon close enough to hurt his boys, but he knew Jasmine was right in making him stop. "I want nothing from you ever again, Lee Fields." Gloria was filthy from the dusty road, but she still refused his help. Lee looked over at Jasmine and shrugged. "We did our part." He started the wagon, and they moved on down the road toward the ranch. "I'm glad she's gone." He put his arm around Jasmine and pulled her close to his side. "Oh, I am too. I didn't want to spend another minute with her." She sighed happily, knowing they'd be home in a few minutes and could start their life together, without his ex-wife bothering them. Mrs. Banks waited until Lee was off working before she confronted Jasmine. "What happened to the room upstairs? The one that's 2 down from the boys' room? I went up there this morning to dust it, and there was something sticky all over the floor." Mrs. Banks eyed Jasmine, obviously trying to figure out what shenanigans the other woman had been up to. Jasmine bit her lip to keep from laughing at the baffled expression on the older woman's face. "Don't worry, Mrs. Banks. It was just honey." She hurried away before she dissolved in huge peals of laughter that she knew Mrs. Banks would not appreciate. She carried her things from her temporary room upstairs down to the bedroom she shared with Lee while the boys played outside. She declared it a school-free day due to the fact that she'd gotten married again. If they kept having to have weddings, the boys' education would be sorely neglected. As she put her things away in her bedroom, she smiled. It was nice to have a wedding day and anticipate a wedding night, knowing what life would be like for her. She made the bed herself, smiling as she thought about the night she would get to spend in it. She was almost thankful Gloria had come along. Now she got to have a second wedding night. Jasmine made a special meal and baked a cake for dinner that evening. After Mrs. Banks left for the day, they ate and had their cake for dessert. "We didn't have a wedding cake the first time," Jasmine told them. "I was determined that we'd have one this time." She forked up another bite of the cake while the boys devoured theirs. She looked around the table, appreciating her family more than before because of the crazy 2 days with Gloria. Jacob smiled. "I'm glad we got rid of that mean mother and got our ma back. Are we going to have cake every time you get married?" His face was so serious that Jasmine decided not to disillusion him. Lee started to explain, but Jasmine put her hand on his to still his words. "Yes, we are. Every single time we get married, I promise you, we'll have cake." The boys exchanged an excited look, and later, Lee asked Jasmine why she'd told them that. Jasmine shrugged. "Because they obviously thought it was a great idea, so why not agree? Today is the only day we'll marry, but cake is what they want, and they got it." She hadn't really lied. If they married again, she would make them cake with no problem. Of course, weddings weren't going to happen in their household as often as the 2 boys seemed to think it would. They tucked the boys into bed together, and Jasmine decided to take a bath afterward. She wanted to be as sweet-smelling as she could when she went to her husband. She quickly dried off and pulled her nightgown over her head, laughing at herself, because she knew that she would only wear it for the short time it took her to walk from the bathroom to the bedroom. When she walked into the bedroom, Lee was sitting propped up in the bed with candles lit all over the room, instead of the lantern. "I thought you'd like the candles better. They're a bit more romantic." He watched her face, obviously hoping he'd made the right call. She smiled, quickly divesting herself of her nightgown and climbing onto the bed with him to join him under the covers. She went straight to him and put her head on his shoulder, not in a huge hurry to make love as she usually was. I was devastated when I thought I was going to lose you and the boys. She hated making herself vulnerable to him by admitting it, but he needed to know how much she cared. She may seem like a tough woman, but she wasn't. She needed to be loved as much as the next woman did. Jasmine couldn't settle for love from anyone else either. It had to be Lee. He pulled her close, both arms going around her and just holding her. I wouldn't have let that happen. If she hadn't come with the divorce papers in hand, I'd have started proceedings myself. He stroked his hand over her hair, kissing her forehead. I'm sorry she caused you so much grief. Jasmine kissed his shoulder. So you don't think just any mother will do for your boys, and any wife for you? She was fishing for compliments, but she had to know she was special to him and not just the only woman who was willing to put up with his boys' nonsense. Lee grinned. You're the only woman I've courted at all since she left. He looked down at her. I've talked to other women, thinking I might be interested, but they were always afraid of my boys. How could I love a woman who couldn't meet my boys head-on, prank for prank? He wondered if she had any idea how special she truly was to him and his boys. He hoped so. She sighed. How could anyone love someone who couldn't deal with a couple of 7-year-olds' pranks? I know that they seemed advanced, but those boys need some help learning how to prank someone well. They were just going to do generic pranks, nothing geared toward Gloria. Do you know they never even thought of putting the honey in her boots? Jasmine shook her head. I'll have to take them in hand. She knew she wasn't a typical mother, but that's not what they needed, and she was proud that she could meet their needs. Lee let out a bark of laughter. Those boys do not need help learning to prank people better. They need to learn that it's not all right to constantly prank people. He kissed the top of her head as his hand stroked down her sides. You'll help me teach them that, right? She and his boys were like peas in a pod. That was what drew him to her. Jasmine shrugged, kissing his cheek. I guess. I like the idea of teaching them to do it better, though. Maybe if she noticed them doing silly pranks, she could help them. Once in a while. I know you do. He lifted her chin for his kiss. I love that about you, Jasmine. Jasmine felt her heart jump. You do? Is that all you love about me? Had he really just said he loved something about her? Did he love her? No one ever had, unless they were family and obligated to love her, of course. Lee was the first person in her life who had cared for her at all without that obligation. He cupped her face in his hands, looking into her eyes by the lights of the candles scattered throughout the room. I love everything about you, Jasmine Fields. You've become everything to me. He kissed her lips gently, before pulling back. Thank you so much for coming into my life and making our family complete. The boys could not have a better mother, and I couldn't have a better wife. Jasmine smiled, her eyes alight with happiness. I love you too. And the boys. I think I loved all 3 of you from the moment I first saw you drag them out of church by their ears. She could still see them as they left the church that morning. What did you do to them for putting that snake in the pastor's Bible? She asked. She'd never actually seen Lee punish the boys, so she wondered what he did when they did something major. He shook his head. The same thing I always do. I talked to them sternly. I need to get more creative with punishments. I just don't feel like I can spank them. Not after the way their mother was. He sighed. I'm afraid I'll go overboard with them. Jasmine smiled. My mother never spanked us either. She said she should have with me, but she never did. She wouldn't spank her boys either. She didn't want their spirits to be ruined. They were too special for anyone to try to hurt them. She'd probably want to a time or 10, but she wouldn't do it. Ever. Do you think we need to spank the boys? He asked. I'd rather not, but you're the one with them all the time now. He waited carefully, worried what her answer would be. I think creative punishments would be better with those 2. She thought for a moment so she could give him an example. For instance, the next time they put a frog in someone's pocket, they should have to do chores for that person for 2 hours unpaid. If they try to prank us, they get the same thing. Neither boy is malicious, so we won't need to do more than that to them. She was all in favor of making the punishment fit the crime. If they had to do chores for someone they scared, maybe that would make them understand that what they did wasn't okay. Lee nodded. I think that's perfect. Maybe they'll stop feeling the need to prank people to get attention with you here as well. They both love you so much. It was obvious in how they were so ready to get rid of Gloria as soon as she came. He stroked her back, glad she never came to bed with her nightgown on. He loved to touch her. I'm so glad she's gone. I was worried that you would realize that you really did love her and you'd forget all about me. She sighed. I couldn't lose you and the boys. My heart would break. She rested her head against his shoulder. I hope you know you're my everything. He looked down at her with a smile. Brushing his lips across the top of her head, he couldn't help but thank God for the joy that came with having this special woman in his life. Epilogue. Hyacinth wandered into the library where Amaryllis was working and with a wave to her sister went to a corner table at the back. She had been working there for months, and no one had asked any questions. She was the quiet one, the odd one, and that suited her just fine. She didn't want any of her nosy sisters to know what she was doing until she was completely finished anyway. She'd just turned 18, and she was so happy to be free of school. She was taller than her sisters at 5 feet 9 inches, and felt like she was just not part of them. She had long hair that could only be described as chestnut that she usually wore in a bun to keep it out of her face. She nodded at the man at the table next to hers, a tall, lanky man, whom she had seen in the library on and off. She knew he'd once been interested in Amaryllis, but now that Amaryllis was happily married with a baby of her own, he'd moved on to simply working in the Seattle library. Just like she had, he smiled at her as usual, but this time, instead of ignoring her, he got up and wandered over to where she was sitting, pulling out the chair across from her. I've seen you here a lot lately. What are you working on? Hyacinth pulled her notebook closer to her, not willing to admit to anything before she was finished. He knew her sister. Just scribbling mostly. Why was he asking? He'd never tried to talk to her before. He held out his hand to her, and she shook it. I'm Lawrence Bennett. I know, you used to court my sister, Amaryllis. She looked down at her papers, not certain what else to say to him. He was a handsome man, one she'd had an interest in for years, not romantically, but she wanted to talk to him about his work. Oh. Which flower are you? Lawrence grinned as he asked the question, obviously thinking he was being terribly original by making a flower joke. Hyacinth looked up at him, wondering if he'd have a real conversation with her, and not just something superficial. I'm Hyacinth, the 6th flower. She didn't add that she was the most boring flower of the bunch, but that's how she felt. Even her own family dismissed her as boring. Amaryllis was the 3rd, right? She could tell he honestly couldn't remember, which pleased her. No man who was as interested in her sister as she'd thought he was, could possibly have forgotten that. She is the 3rd. He smiled, leaning back in his chair. Your family has always fascinated me. What's the order of the names again? Hyacinth sighed. Of course he was interested in her family, and not her. Why would anyone ever be interested in her? Rose, Lily, Amaryllis, Daisy, Jasmine, Hyacinth, Violet, and Iris. Wow. I forget there are so many of you. All right, I know Amaryllis married Alex, but what about Daisy and Jasmine? Are they around? Happily married and all that? He seemed genuinely interested, so she answered him. She couldn't help but wonder if he was researching them for a book. Every person she met became part of some story she made up. She had so many stories she'd written over the years, mostly short stories, but she so badly wanted to get them published. Maybe if she answered his questions, he would answer hers. Daisy became a mail-order bride and moved to Montana. She is married to Eli, and they have a daughter, Dinah. She's expecting again. Lawrence nodded. Very nice. I'm sure your mother is very happy with all the grandchildren. What about Jasmine? Was she the crazy one? The one Amaryllis always called a demented nincompoop? Hyacinth grinned despite herself. Yes, that's Jasmine. She went to help Amaryllis when she was pregnant with Dinah, and she met a man at church there. She married him and stayed in Montana, so now 2 of us are in Montana, but the other 6 are still here in Seattle. She missed her sisters, but really? She was glad there were fewer flowers walking around. It made it easier for people to remember her name and which one she was. And what about Hyacinth? Are you getting married soon? She looked at him in surprise. I hadn't really thought about it. I'm absorbed in my scribbling. She closed her notebook when she saw him looking at it. She wasn't ready for anyone to see it, and especially not a published author. What are you scribbling about? Hyacinth looked down. She didn't want to tell him, but she knew he couldn't help her if she didn't. Besides, he'd once been an unpublished writer, writing his first book, right? It's a book I'm writing. A love story. She blushed as she added the last part. She'd never been in love. Was she even capable of writing a love story? Lawrence grinned at her. Really? A book? And a love story? I want to read it. He reached for her notebook, but she plucked it off the table and clutched it to her chest. Please? Hyacinth shook her head. Not before it's finished. It's my first novel. I have a lot of short stories, but this one is too important to me. She shrugged. Maybe someday I could let someone see it. Like when she was ready to talk about publication. Then she'd have to let someone see it, wouldn't she? Why don't I take you to the restaurant for dinner tonight, and we can talk about our writing? She looked at him with surprise. You wouldn't mind talking to me about it? Not at all. I would love to. I don't know any other writers here in Seattle, and it would be nice to have a chance to talk shop for a bit. He smiled. Besides, who doesn't want to take a pretty lady to dinner? She blushed at the compliment. Had anyone other than her family ever called her pretty before? She had always thought of her looks as boring like her personality. She didn't live, she wrote about living. I thought, well, sure. I'd like that. She knew she wasn't speaking well and must be coming across as an imbecile. He smiled, reaching out to squeeze her hand. I'll come by your house and pick you up around 6. Would that work? And maybe we can go for a drive after. Hyacinth looked at him for a moment before nodding. I thought you traveled around all the time. What are you doing back in Seattle? Would he just be a temporary friend? Or was he back for good? She'd seen him a lot lately. Lawrence shrugged. I got tired of not having a home base. My relationship with the local Indian tribe has made it to where this is a good place for me to research, so I bought a house here a couple of months ago. It's a good place for me to settle down, that makes sense. She wanted to say more, but she was afraid if she did, he would rescind his offer of dinner, so instead, she stood up, still clutching her notebook to her chest. I'll see you this evening, then. Lawrence watched her leave before going to the front desk of the library. He spotted Amaryllis sitting there, eating her lunch and reading a book. She took a big bite out of an apple, and he cleared his throat so she would notice he was there. Oh, Lawrence. Hi. What can I help you with today? They'd stayed friends even after her marriage, much to her husband's annoyance. I was wondering about your sister, Hyacinth. He saw no reason not to get straight to the point. They were friends, so there was no need for him to stand around and pretend to need something else first. Oh, you were? Amaryllis looked over her shoulder where her sister had just left. What do you want to know? He shrugged. What can you tell me? Let's start with her age. I want to make sure I didn't just ask a 16-year-old girl to have dinner with me. Amaryllis looked at him with wide eyes. You and Hi are having dinner? Really? He nodded. Why is that so hard to believe? She's a pretty girl, and we seem to have a lot in common. Amaryllis gave him a surprised look. I guess you do. She shrugged. She just turned 18 a few weeks ago. She finished school in May, and she spends a lot of time here, doing God knows what, and she volunteers at the battered women's shelter that Alex's parents run. She raised her hands palm up. That's honestly all I know about her. She's really dreamy and quiet, but she's not shy like Daisy. She's just very private. Lawrence smiled. The things that mystified Hyacinth's sister about her, he understood. She must not mention her writing to anyone, or Amaryllis would know why she was the way she was. That's mainly what I needed to know. Thank you, Amaryllis. He walked back to his table where he'd been working and sat down. Hyacinth Sullivan. Who'd have ever thought he'd be interested in one of Amaryllis's little sisters?